The Metaphysics of Sexual Love. Here we go. For all love, however ethereally it may bear itself, is rooted in the sexual impulse alone. Nay, it absolutely is only a more definitely determined, specialized, and indeed in the strictest sense individualized sexual impulse. This video series is about Chapter 44 of Volume 2 of The World as Will and Representation. This is titled On the Metaphysics of Sexual Love. Now, Volume 2 is a series of essays commenting upon the earlier work in Volume 1, and this chapter really presents a kind of self-contained essay of Schopenhauer's on this topic. We get the idea of what it's about from the title. It's about metaphysics, about the fundamental reality, the thing in itself behind appearances that lies behind and beneath our experience of sexual attraction between men and women. And we should expect, knowing Schopenhauer as we do, that the answer will somehow involve this reality of will, this blind, striving life force that simply wants and is never satisfied. So Schopenhauer will be walking us through how his system of metaphysics explains the reality that we all live through of this type of sexual attraction, both in general and then in very specific cases with respect to the individual object of my attention, my affection, and my longing. In giving this theory, Schopenhauer is going to give us a theory of the psychological and biological undercurrents of our conscious thought and choices in a way that interestingly anticipates sociobiology by more than a century. I think this chapter contains some valuable psychological observations and insights, but also some speculation that is kind of regrettable, even into the crossing the boundary into cringe. But we should remember that Schopenhauer here is writing several decades before Darwin, and he's engaging in a similar project by minimally Christian all the way to non-Christian intellectuals to try to work out what is really going on behind, in this case, the attraction and behaviors that we go through as human beings. Well, what's the sort of material biological basis? And then for Schopenhauer, what's the sort of deeper metaphysical basis that's going on behind people's love affairs, their affections, their betrayals, their feelings of passionate commitment, even to the point of self-destruction if they are ultimately frustrated. So Schopenhauer's trying to work out what's really going on here. Like most theories of sexuality, this one tells us a great deal about the author and about his assumptions too. So I expect that we'll learn something about Schopenhauer's character and attitude towards women. This does fit in very well, I think, with the rest of Schopenhauer's thought. For more of that, you should see my previous video series on studies in pessimism, counsels and maxims, and the art of literature. But for now, let's go on to the text. In the first section of this chapter, Schopenhauer situates his inquiry into the metaphysics of sexual love and notes that there's been very little attention paid to this topic by previous philosophers, although a great deal of attention paid to it by poets. And he notes also the important place that sexual romantic love plays in culture, both now and in the past. So this is a topic worthy of investigation. Here's what he writes. Ye wise men, highly, deeply learned, who think it out and know how, when, and where do all things pair? Why do they kiss and love? Ye men of lofty wisdom, say, what happened to me then? Search out and tell me where, how, when, and why it happened thus. This chapter is the last of 4, whose various reciprocal relations, by virtue of which, to a certain extent, they constitute a subordinate whole, the attentive reader will recognize, without it being needful for me to interrupt my exposition by recalling them or referring to them. We are accustomed to see poets principally occupied with describing the love of the sexes. This is, as a rule, the chief theme of all dramatic works, tragical as well as comical, romantic as well as classical, Indian as well as European. Not less is it the material of by far the largest part of lyrical and also of epic poetry, especially if we class with the latter the enormous piles of romances which for centuries every year has produced in all the civilized countries of Europe as regularly as the fruits of the earth. As regards their main contents, all these works are nothing else than many-sided brief or lengthy descriptions of the passions we are speaking of. Moreover, the most successful pictures of it, such for example as Romeo and Juliet, La Nouvelle Héloïse, and Werther, have gained immortal fame. Yet, when Rochefoucauld imagines that it is the same with passionate love as with ghosts, of which everyone speaks but which no one has seen, and Lichtenberg also in his essay Über die Macht der Liebe disputes and denies the reality and naturalness of that passion, they are greatly in error. For it is impossible that something which is foreign and contrary to human nature, thus a mere imaginary caricature, could be unweariedly represented by poetic genius in all ages, and received by mankind with unaltered interest, for nothing that is artistically beautiful can be without truth. Rien n'est beau que le vrai seul est aimable. Nothing is beautiful but the truth alone can be loved. Certainly, however, it is also confirmed by experience, although not by the experience of every day, that which as a rule only appears as a strong yet still controllable inclination may rise, under certain circumstances, to a passion which exceeds all others in vehemence, and which then sets aside all considerations, overcomes all obstacles with incredible strength and perseverance, so that for its satisfaction life is risked without hesitation, nay, if that satisfaction is still withheld, is given as the price of it. Werthers and Jacopo Ortiz exist not only in romance, but every year can show at least half a dozen of them in Europe. Sed ignotis perierunt mortibus illi. Yet there were no reports of the deaths they died. For their sorrows find no other chroniclers than the writers of official registers, or the reporters of the newspapers. Yet the readers of the police news in English and French journals will attest the correctness of my assertion. Still greater, however, is the number of those whom the same passion brings to the madhouse. Finally, every year can show cases of the double suicide of a pair of lovers who are opposed by outward circumstances. In such cases, however, it is inexplicable to me how those who, certain of mutual love, expect to find the supremest bliss in the enjoyment of this, do not withdraw themselves from all connections by taking the extremest steps, and endure all hardships, rather than give up with life a pleasure which is greater than any other they can conceive. As regards the lower grades of that passion, and the mere approaches to it, everyone has them daily before his eyes, and, as long as he is not old, for the most part also in his heart. So then, after what has been here called to mind, no one can doubt either the reality or the importance of the matter. And therefore, instead of wondering that a philosophy should also for once make its own this constant theme of all poets, one ought rather to be surprised that a thing which plays throughout so important a part in human life has hitherto practically been disregarded by philosophers altogether, and lies before us as raw material. The one who has most concerned himself with it is Plato, especially in the Symposium and the Phaedrus. Yet what he says on the subject is confined to the sphere of myths, fables, and jokes, and also, for the most part, concerns only the Greek love of youths. The little that Rousseau says upon our theme in the Discours sur l'inégalité is false and insufficient. Kant's explanation of the subject in the third part of the essay Über das Gefühl des Schönen und Erhabenen is very superficial and without practical knowledge. Therefore, it is also partly incorrect. Lastly, Platner's treatment of the matter in his Anthropology everyone will find dull and shallow. On the other hand, Spinoza's definition, on account of its excessive naivete, deserves to be quoted for the sake of amusement. Amor est titillatio concomitante idea causa externe. Love is titillation accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Accordingly, I have no predecessors, either to make use of or to refute. The subject has pressed itself upon me objectively, and has entered of its own accord into the connection of my consideration of the world. Moreover, least of all can I hope for approbation from those who are themselves under the power of this passion, and who accordingly seek to express the excess of their feelings in the sublimest and most ethereal images. To them, my view will appear too physical, too material, however metaphysical and even transcendent it may be at bottom. Meanwhile, let them reflect that if the object which today inspires them to write madrigals and sonnets had been born 18 years earlier, it would scarcely have won a glance from them. For all love, however ethereally it may bear itself, is rooted in the sexual impulse alone. Nay, it absolutely is only a more definitely determined, specialized, and indeed in the strictest sense individualized sexual impulse. If now, keeping this in view, one considers the important part which the sexual impulse, in all its degrees and nuances, plays not only on the stage and in novels, but also in the real world, where next to the love of life, it shows itself the strongest and most powerful of motives, constantly lays claim to half the powers and thoughts of the younger portion of mankind, is the ultimate goal of almost all human effort, exerts an adverse influence on the most important events, interrupts the most serious occupations every hour, sometimes embarrasses for a little while even the greatest minds, does not hesitate to intrude with its trash, interfering with the negotiations of statesmen and the investigations of men of learning, knows how to slip its love letters and locks of hair even into ministerial portfolios and philosophical manuscripts, and no less devises daily the most entangled and the worst actions, destroys the most valuable relationships, breaks the firmest bonds, demands the sacrifice sometimes of life or health, sometimes of wealth, rank, and happiness, nay, robs those who are otherwise honest of all conscience, makes those who have hitherto been faithful traitors. Accordingly, on the whole, appears as a malevolent demon that strives to pervert, confuse, and overthrow everything. Then one will be forced to cry, "Wherefore all this noise? Wherefore the straining and storming, the anxiety and want? It is merely a question of every Hans finding his Greta." Footnote. I have not ventured to express myself distinctly here. The courteous reader must therefore translate the phrase into Aristophanic language. Schopenhauer begins this section by connecting it to the 3 previous chapters of this part of Volume 2, dealing with death, species being, and heredity. These are all part of the same project. Now we're looking at that sexual psychology and its metaphysical basis in human existence and human self-consciousness. Romantic love and the costs of romantic love, including people's frustration and making away with themselves, have been material for poets at all times and in all places. So this is an important topic that has held the interest of humanity, both poets and readers, although not, for some reason, philosophers, for so long, and has been studied so been commented upon so widely. Yet the very few philosophers who have endeavored to talk about this, Plato, Kant, Spinoza, have gotten it wrong. In Spinoza's case, kind of absurdly wrong, right? Love, he says, is titillation accompanied by the idea that there's some sort of external cause for it. So all of these previous philosophical attempts have been plainly inadequate. Schopenhauer observes, in a sense, I've got the field to myself. Even writing here in the 1830s, I'm one of the first people to really take this topic seriously and to investigate it with clear-eyed observation and a coherent theory of metaphysics and reality behind me. He expects for this task, he expects no praise from lovers who are too deeply involved in the reality of their feelings, or from poets, or from philosophers. And this has just been the path that Schopenhauer has tread his entire life. He concludes, this is a section that I've ended with here, he concludes with his observation that this is simply a matter of every Hans finding his Greta, or other translations say every Jack finding his Jill. And I won't be more explicit about this. He says you can translate this into the language of Aristophanes, the sort of cruder, more brutal, obnoxious language from classic Greek comedies. I'm not going to translate it into Aristophanic language for you, but he's making it quite clear to the reader that we're talking about something here which, at its base, is quite plain and evident and even crude. So, in the next section of the chapter, Schopenhauer is going to articulate what I call his thesis about what really is going on at the basis, that's the metaphysical basis of sexual attraction and affection. So he'll elaborate this thesis and then go on to giving proofs and examples. So we'll look at that next. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.
The Metaphysics of Sexual Love, Part 2. Now, in this case, the sexual impulse, although in itself a subjective need, knows how to assume very skillfully the mask of an objective admiration, and thus to deceive our consciousness. For nature requires this stratagem to attain its ends. In this section, Schopenhauer explains what I've called his thesis for the chapter, the real metaphysical basis of sexual attraction between men and women. His answer is going to be biological, but also metaphysical, in the sense that the biology for Schopenhauer is going to ride on top of this deeper metaphysics of the will as the fundamental reality of what's going on in us, both of these below the level of conscious decision and choice. He's going to explain this in terms of the will of the species. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. Why should such a trifle play so important a part and constantly introduce disturbance and confusion into the well-regulated life of man? But to the earnest investigator, the spirit of truth gradually reveals the answer. It is no trifle that is in question here. On the contrary, the importance of the matter is quite proportionate to the seriousness and ardor of the effort. The ultimate end of all love affairs, whether they are played in sock or cothurnus, is really more important than all the other ends of human life, and is therefore quite worthy of the profound seriousness with which everyone pursues it. That which is decided by it is nothing less than the composition of the next generation. The dramatis personae who shall appear when we are withdrawn are here determined, both as regards their existence and their nature, by these frivolous love affairs. As the being, the existentia, of these future persons is absolutely conditioned by our sexual impulse generally, so their nature, essentia, is determined by the individual selection in its satisfaction, that is, by sexual love, and is in every respect irrevocably fixed by this. This is the key of the problem. We shall arrive at a more accurate knowledge of it in its application if we go through the degrees of love, from the passing inclination to the vehement passion, when we shall also recognize that the difference of these grades arises from the degree of the individualization of the choice. The collective love affairs of the present generation, taken together, are, accordingly, of the whole human race, the serious meditatio compositionis generationis futurae, aeque iterum pendent innumerae generationes, meditation on the composition of the future generation, on which in turn countless generations depend. This high importance of the matter, in which it is not a question of individual weal or woe, as in all other matters, but of the existence and special nature of the human race in future times, and therefore the will of the individual appears at a higher power as the will of the species. This it is on which the pathetic and sublime elements in affairs of love depend, which for thousands of years poets have never wearied of representing in innumerable examples, because no theme can equal in interest this one, which stands to all others which only concern the welfare of individuals, as the solid body to the surface, because it concerns the weal and woe of the species. Just on this account, then, is it so difficult to impart interest to a drama without the element of love, and on the other hand, this theme is never worn out, even by daily use. That which presents itself in the individual consciousness as sexual impulse in general, without being directed towards a definite individual of the other sex, is in itself, and apart from the phenomenon, simply the will to live. But what appears in consciousness as a sexual impulse directed to a definite individual is in itself the will to live as a definitely determined individual. Now, in this case, the sexual impulse, although in itself a subjective need, knows how to assume very skillfully the mask of an objective admiration, and thus to deceive our consciousness. For nature requires this stratagem to attain its ends. But yet that in every case of falling in love, however objective and sublime this admiration may appear, what alone is looked to is the production of an individual of a definite nature is primarily confirmed by the fact that the essential matter is not the reciprocation of love, but possession, that is, the physical enjoyment. The certainty of the former can therefore by no means console us for the want of the latter. On the contrary, in such a situation many a man has shot himself. On the other hand, persons who are deeply in love and can obtain no return of it are contented with possession, that is, with the physical enjoyment. This is proved by all forced marriages, and also by the frequent purchase of the favor of a woman, in spite of her dislike, by large presents and other sacrifices, nay, even by cases of rape. That this particular child shall be begotten is, although unknown to the parties concerned, the true end of the whole love story. The manner in which it is attained is a secondary consideration. Now, however loudly persons of lofty and sentimental soul, and especially those who are in love, may cry out here about the gross realism of my view, they are yet in error. For is not the definite determination of the individualities of the next generation a much higher and more worthy end than those exuberant feelings and sensible soap bubbles of theirs? Nay, among earthly aims, can there be one which is greater or more important? It alone corresponds to the profoundness with which passionate love is felt, to the seriousness with which it appears, and the importance which it attributes even to trifling details of its sphere and occasion. Only so far as this end is assumed as the true one do the difficulties encountered, the infinite exertions and annoyances made and endured for the attainment of the loved object, appear proportionate to the matter. For it is the future generation in its whole individual determinateness that presses into existence by means of these efforts and toils. Nay, it is itself already active in that careful, definite, and arbitrary choice for the satisfaction of the sexual impulse, which we call love. The growing inclination of two lovers is really already the will to live of the new individual which they can and desire to produce. Nay, even in the meeting of their longing glances, its new life breaks out and announces itself as a future individuality harmoniously and well composed. They feel the longing for an actual union and fusing together into a single being in order to live on only as this, and this longing receives its fulfillment in the child which is produced by them, as that in which the qualities transmitted by them both, fused and united into one being, live on. Conversely, the mutual, decided, and persistent aversion between a man and a maid is a sign that what they could produce would only be a badly organized, in itself inharmonious, and unhappy being. Hence, there lies a deeper meaning in the fact that Calderon, though he calls the atrocious Semiramis the daughter of the air, yet introduces her as the daughter of rape, followed by the murder of the husband. But finally, what draws two individuals of different sex exclusively to each other with such power is the will to live, which exhibits itself in the whole species, and which here anticipates in the individual which these two can produce an objectification of its nature answering to its aims. This individual will have the will or character from the father, and the intellect from the mother, and the corporization from both. Yet, for the most part, the figure will take more after the father, the size after the mother, according to the law which comes out in the breeding of hybrids among the brutes, and principally depends upon the fact that the size of the fetus must conform to the size of the uterus. Just as inexplicable as the quite specific individuality of any man, which is exclusively peculiar to him, is also the quite special and individual passion of two lovers. Indeed, at bottom, the two are one and the same. The former is explicite, what the latter was implicite. The moment at which the parents begin to love each other, to fancy each other, as the very happy English expression has it, is really to be regarded as the first appearance of a new individual and the true punctum saliens of its life. And, as has been said, in the meeting and fixing of their longing glances, there appears the first germ of a new being, which certainly, like all germs, is generally crushed out. This new individual is to a certain extent a new Platonic idea, and now, as all ideas strive with greatest vehemence to enter the phenomenal world, eagerly seizing for this end upon the matter which the law of causality divides among them all, so also does this particular idea of a human individuality strive with the greatest eagerness and vehemence towards its realization in the phenomenon. This eagerness and vehemence is just the passion of the two future parents for each other. It has innumerable degrees, the two extremes of which may at any rate be described as Aphrodite, Pandemos, and Urania. Aphrodite, vulgar and heavenly. In its nature, however, it is everywhere the same. On the other hand, it will be in degree so much the more powerful, the more individualized it is. That is, the more the loved individual is exclusively suited, by virtue of all his or her parts and qualities, to satisfy the desire of the lover and the need established by his or her own individuality. What is really in question here will become clear in the future course of our exposition. Primarily and essentially, the inclination of love is directed to health, strength, and beauty, consequently also to youth, because the will, first of all, seeks to exhibit the specific character of the human species as the basis of all individuality. Ordinary amorousness, Aphrodite Pandemos, does not go much further. To these, then, more special claims link themselves on, which we shall investigate in detail further on, and with which, when they see satisfaction before them, the passion increases. But the highest degrees of this passion spring from that suitableness of two individualities to each other, on account of which the will, that is, the character of the father and the intellect of the mother, in their connection, make up precisely that individual towards which the will to live in general, which exhibits itself in the whole species, feels a longing proportionate to this its magnitude, and which therefore exceeds the measure of a mortal heart, and the motives of which, in the same way, lie beyond the sphere of the individual intellect. This is thus the soul of a true and great passion. Now, the more perfect is the mutual adaptation of the two individuals to each other, in each of the many respects which have further to be considered, the stronger will be their mutual passion. Since there do not exist two individuals exactly alike, there must be for each particular man a particular woman, always with reference to what is to be produced, who corresponds most perfectly. A really passionate love is as rare as the accident of these two meeting. Since, however, the possibility of such a love is present in every one, the representations of it in the works of the poets are comprehensible to us. Just because the passion of love really turns about that which is to be produced, and its qualities, and because its kernel lies there, a friendship without any admixture of sexual love can exist between two young and good-looking persons of different sex, on account of the agreement of their disposition, character, and mental tendencies. Nay, as regards sexual love, there may even be a certain aversion between them. The reason of this is to be sought in the fact that a child produced by them would have physical or mental qualities which were inharmonious. In short, its existence and nature would not answer the ends of the will to live as it exhibits itself in the species. On the other hand, in the case of difference of disposition, character, and mental tendency, and the dislike, nay, enmity proceeding from this, sexual love may yet arise and exist. When it then blinds us to all that, and if it here leads to marriage, it will be a very unhappy one. So why should sex be so important to us? It's not for the sake of emotional satisfaction, because this is too trivial. It doesn't meet the magnitude required. People feel their entire lives dominated by this kind of attraction, affection, and love. And if it's simply a matter of having certain kinds of emotional experiences, those factors don't seem to be significant enough to explain the lived reality that we all have. What's really behind this, Schopenhauer says, is the composition of the next generation of the human race. It is the child that's to be produced by the union of a certain man with a certain woman. This is the real deal with respect to sexual attraction and romantic love, and it's vastly more important than what he calls the soap bubble feelings of the individual lovers. So in terms of will, the existence of the next generation is provided for by a generalized sexual impulse, right? Men want women, women want men. But the specific character of that generation, its essence, is provided by our individualized sexual attractions. My attraction to this woman, her attraction to that man in particular. The entire chapter is therefore going to be an elaboration of this thesis in more detail and with greater and greater context and speculation. Schopenhauer then reiterates, this is a goal of the utmost importance for will. Will is this life force that wants to continue, this striving to continue living. It's important to remember, especially for those of us raised on Nietzsche, that for Schopenhauer, the will to live is a bad thing because it's a source of unhappiness. It's a thing that we must overcome and learn to deal with and to tame within ourselves. The more we surrender to it, the more miserable our lives are going to be. So there is for Schopenhauer both a generalized sexual impulse, that's the desire of a man for women in general, just any woman, and this is the will to live, to perpetuate the species across time, that's active in me when I have that feeling, when I have that impulse, that attraction to women in general. Notice that's kind of unfocused, and there's something a little bit vulgar or even repulsive about that. I kind of feel like a person feeling that level of attraction this is not mankind at its best, I might say. Along with this, though, there's the individualized sexual impulse. This is my desire for this particular romantic partner, this particular woman, and this is a manifestation of the individual will to live. So insofar as I only want women, or a woman, I'm thinking sort of feeling on behalf of the entire human race, insofar as I want this particular woman that I pursue, that I woo, that I marry, that I have lived my life with, I'm expressing my individual will to live, to go on, to perpetuate my individual life as to pass on the ways of my ancestors, my religion, my values, etc., to my specific children. So these are both levels of this will are operating in the same individual at the same time. The key insight, I think, from this section is that the subjective sexual impulse in any person will mask itself as objective admiration. That is, I will take my attraction to this particular woman, but I will tell myself that she really is objectively a person of quality, a person well suited to me, that there are all these objective factors which disguise the subjective impulse that's really behind this. In other words, no matter what I think of her, what will has in mind is the existence and character of our children. And as proof of this, Schopenhauer offers the fact that people will be satisfied with sex, provided that even in the absence of reciprocal love. I would like her to love me back, but if I can have the sexual relationship with her without the mutual affection and love, well, that's tolerable. Sex without love is tolerable, but love without sex, he says, people will kill themselves over that. I've known people who could not endure having that kind of relationship for a long period of time. And I said in the previous video that I thought some elements of Schopenhauer's personality and life experience would come out, and I think this is one of those cases, one of those places. He also mentions that this is demonstrated, he thinks, by the existence of forced marriages and what we might call in our own time trophy wives, women whose affection can be purchased by large gifts. What's behind all of these, though, is the drive of will to create a particular child that Will has in mind, this particular child created by these two parents. That's the fundamental reality that is driving their attraction for each other. And that attraction will be strong or weak according as the objective character, the character of the child to be born, is going to be healthy or unhealthy, etc. So it's important to keep in mind, Schopenhauer is writing this several decades before Darwin and half a century before the genetics revolution. So this is going to have a kind of interesting theory that straddles, we might say, biology and metaphysics, where we might be satisfied with the genetic biological answer. Schopenhauer will give us something like that answer, but then he'll take it deeper and say what's really happening here is the manifestation of this immaterial blind life force called will that is sort of reaching up into, sort of from underneath, like a puppeteer, into our lives to direct our attention in certain ways, to control our choices. Schopenhauer tells us that the initial attraction of two lovers for each other is the will to live of their future child acting in them. And this is why they feel fulfilled when the child is finally conceived and born. In a sense, will, acting through both of them, is finally satisfied. Here is the one who will survive them. Here's the one who will push on the life of the species and the life of these individuals farther into the future, past their own natural deaths. He also says that a mutual aversion or even revulsion between a man and a woman, they can't stand each other, this is a sign that their offspring would be deformed or unhealthy. It's good that they don't have any desire to get together in a sexual way, because the offspring would be not to the credit and benefit of the human race. They wouldn't serve the ends of will, so to speak. Schopenhauer here has a couple of ideas, specific ideas about the way that reproduction would work. That the child inherits his will, force of will from his father, his intellect from his mother, his character from his father, his intellect from his mother. In terms of body in general, the shape of the body comes from the father, the sort of build, the size of the body from the mother. He tries to ground this in observations about hybridization of animals, of course. Loves, he says, are as individual as persons. Just as will can be specified in a highly determined way in a particular individual, the love that a pair of lovers feel for each other will be quite specific and detailed when will is focused down into this one particular form, highly individualized. So we're not going to see a sort of general theory of love in terms of those specifics. When lovers first begin to fancy each other, and here in the German he quotes the words in English, to fancy each other, nice English expression, what's really happening here is that the child, their future child, as will, is already been created at the metaphysical level and is in a sense reaching back in time to direct them towards each other. Schopenhauer says, like many germs that are ultimately trod underfoot and die, this sort of nascent will of the future child is, in this translation it says generally crushed out, which I couldn't quite understand. More recent translations say it is usually crushed underfoot. So we would think, in other words, the prospective child is often not actually born. That is, the initial love is not consummated. But when the lovers begin to cast these kind of glances at each other, begin to think, what Schopenhauer is saying is that sort of beneath the conscious, beneath the biological, at the level of will, there's a sense in which there's this kind of future being, which is calling across time to them to create it. And that won't happen all the time, obviously, but that's what's drawing them on and what's driving them, is this element of will. The eagerness of this will to become real is what accounts for the passion that the parents have for each other. So if they have a great deal of passion for each other, it's the sign that the future child would be strong, healthy, etc. And the will, therefore, is strong, and therefore the conscious feelings of passion, of dedication, of willingness to sacrifice one's life or wealth or position for the sake of the beloved is quite strong. This passion has degrees of intensity. Schopenhauer calls them Aphrodite, vulgar, that is common, and also heavenly or divine. So kind of two ends of a spectrum of Aphrodite, sort of common Aphrodite and splendid divine Aphrodite. The passion between the lovers will be more intense as the individuals are better suited to each other. And he promises to say more about this later. That'll be in the next video. The goals that Will has will direct the lovers to be attracted to, in general, youth, health, strength, and beauty. Why? Well, because these are signs of strong life in the human species in general. And this is the basis, he says, for ordinary affection, for sort of ordinary love affairs, common attraction. That may be all that is at work. Just as this person is young, healthy, strong, beautiful. These are signs of life, and so the will to life in me is sort of affirming directing my desire towards this person. But there are special factors that incline some specific individuals towards other specific individuals. And again, Schopenhauer promises more on this later in the next section. A great and powerful passion in love lies well beyond the sphere of the intellect. I think this is an important insight, and this helps to explain why love is not a matter of intellectual power and control. People don't reason themselves into loving whom they feel they ought to love, who they reason and conclude that they ought to love. Smart people can be utterly befuddled by passion, right? I might have a completely irrational love affair or attraction, I might say. I'm a strong, powerful, prominent businessman. Why am I attracted to this nobody, to this waitress who's got vulgar manners and who really seems completely unsuited to me in every way? Well, what's happening is that, will has got its hooks into me, and it's directed me towards this particular woman because it sees that somehow the combination of us in a future child will be good for it, for will. And therefore, I'm completely powerless, right? All of my intellect, all of my reasoning, etc., is completely powerless, given the pull, the pull that romantic and sexual love has for me towards a particular object of my affection. This accounts for the completely irrational character of it. It's not a matter of thought or of knowledge. Your thinking and your knowing is completely irrelevant. It's not even a matter of feeling. It's a matter of will, right? Will sort of in you. And I should say, I've been speaking about will as though it's a kind of external puppet master, sort of directing you towards things, like will is rubbing its hands together and saying, aha, I'm going to get this guy together with this woman. It's not quite that. Will is internal, right? I am will when I feel attraction for my wife, my future wife, for this woman, for that woman. When I'm debating, which of these two romantic partners should I pursue, I am in fact being will. That is will in me. So it's not external to me. That's something to keep in mind, I think, as we go forward. The strongest passion, Schopenhauer says, comes from the most perfect adaptation or complementarity of each lover to the other. This is extremely rare, but it is possible for all of us, which is why romantic literature is meaningful for us. We can read it and be moved by it and sort of feel the power of it, the pull of it within ourselves, because although it's maybe very unlikely that each of us would meet somebody who's perfectly adapted to us in our own particularity, we understand that that's a possibility for each of us. There is a sort of perfect, I wouldn't say soulmate, but a person who is a perfect complement of me, for whom I would feel that passion if I happened to meet her at the right point in my life, Schopenhauer seems to say here. A consequence of this theory is that men and women can be friends in a non-sexual way, even, in fact, ideally with a kind of sexual revulsion between them, that they have no interest whatever in each other. Why? This is a sign that the child that they would produce would be unsuitable and unhealthy, or deformed or in some fashion. And will, therefore, the fundamental reality of human existence, of all existence, will has no interest in provoking them to mate. I might work with a woman and think, well, she's attractive, she's fine, she's great, nice personality, but she just doesn't do it for me. I don't feel anything for her. Schopenhauer will say the root of this is will, is detecting that this would not work out well in terms of the constitution of any child that you would have. And therefore, I've put kind of a mild enmity between you. You can work together, perfectly well, and be friends, even have a kind of friendly affection with no sexual element, because will is in control of that. And will determine, quite independently of anything that any of us will think consciously and deliberately, will determine who we're attracted to and who we're not. I think for this overall section, the most revealing part for me was the part I emphasized before, that the subjective desire for this particular person will often wear this kind of mask of objective quality and admiration. I'll tell myself that all these things about her are objectively good and admirable and fine and excellent, but that's what I'm bound to believe because that's what will is going to tell me. It's not that it's false, it's that it doesn't even matter whether it's true or false. Will is going to cause me to believe and think those things because that's what serves will's goals. That's what allows it to achieve its goal, which is to produce the best possible future human race. That's really all that will is concerned about. My own emotions, etc., completely irrelevant to it except as a tool for will achieving its ultimate end through me. The next section of this chapter is where Schopenhauer promises a more thorough elaboration of the thesis with many examples and speculations. And we'll look at that in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.
The Metaphysics of Sexual Love, Part 3. Therefore, in such a case, nature can only attain its ends by implanting a certain illusion in the individual, on account of which that which is only good for the species appears to him as a good for himself, so that when he serves the species he imagines he is serving himself, in which process a mere chimera, which vanishes immediately afterwards, floats before him and takes the place of a real thing as a motive. This illusion is instinct. Previously, Schopenhauer has introduced his thesis that all sexual love is determined by the force of will seeking to direct the composition of the next generation. In this third part of his chapter on the metaphysics of sexual love, Schopenhauer gives us a more thorough elaboration of his view and its implications. Here's what he writes.
Let us now set about the more thorough investigation of the matter. Egoism is so deeply rooted a quality of all individuals in general that in order to rouse the activity of an individual being, egoistical ends are the only ones upon which we can count with certainty. Certainly the species has an earlier, closer, and greater claim upon the individual than the perishable individuality itself. Yet when the individual has to act, and even make sacrifices for the continuance and quality of the species, the importance of the matter cannot be made so comprehensible to his intellect, which is calculated merely with regard to individual ends, as to have its proportionate effect. Therefore, in such a case, nature can only attain its ends by implanting a certain illusion in the individual, on account of which that which is only a good for the species appears to him as a good for himself, so that when he serves the species, he imagines he is serving himself, in which process a mere chimera, which vanishes immediately afterwards, floats before him, and takes the place of a real thing as a motive. This illusion is instinct. In the great majority of cases, this is to be regarded as the sense of the species, which presents what is of benefit to it to the will. Since, however, the will has here become individual, it must be so deluded that it apprehends through the sense of the individual what the sense of the species presents to it, thus imagines it is following individual ends, while in truth it is pursuing ends which are merely general, taking this word in its strictest sense. The external phenomenon of instinct we can best observe in the brutes, where its role is most important. But it is in ourselves alone that we arrive at a knowledge of its internal process, as of everything internal. Now, it is certainly supposed that man has almost no instinct, at any rate only this, that the newborn babe seeks for and seizes the breast of its mother. But in fact, we have a very definite, distinct, and complicated instinct, that of the selection of another individual for the satisfaction of the sexual impulse, a selection which is so fine, so serious, and so arbitrary. With this satisfaction in itself, that is, so far as it is a sensual pleasure resting upon a pressing want of the individual, the beauty or ugliness of the other individual has nothing to do. Thus, the regard for this, which is yet pursued with such ardor, together with the careful selection which springs from it, is evidently connected not with the chooser himself, although he imagines it is so, but with the true end, that which is to be produced, which is to receive the type of the species as purely and correctly as possible. Through 1,000 physical accidents and moral aberrations, there arise a great variety of deteriorations of the human form. Yet its true type, in all its parts, is always again established. And this takes place under the guidance of the sense of beauty, which always directs the sexual impulse, and without which this sinks to the level of a disgusting necessity. Accordingly, in the first place, everyone will decidedly prefer and eagerly desire the most beautiful individuals, that is, those in whom the character of the species is most purely impressed. But secondly, each one will specially regard as beautiful, in another individual, those perfections which he himself lacks, nay, even those imperfections which are the opposite of his own. Hence, for example, little men love big women, fair persons like dark, etc., etc. The delusive ecstasy which seizes a man at the sight of a woman whose beauty is suited to him, and pictures to him a union with her as the highest good, is just the sense of the species, which, recognizing the distinctly expressed stamp of the same, desires to perpetuate it with this individual. Upon this decided inclination to beauty depends the maintenance of the type of the species. Hence it acts with such great power. We shall examine specially further on the considerations which it follows. Thus, what guides man here is really an instinct which is directed to doing the best for the species, while the man himself imagines that he only seeks the heightening of his own pleasure. In fact, we have in this an instructive lesson concerning the inner nature of all instinct, which, as here, almost always sets the individual in motion for the good of the species. For clearly, the pains with which an insect seeks out a particular flower, or fruit, or dung, or flesh, or, as in the case of the Ichneumonidae, the larva of another insect, in order to deposit its eggs there only, and to attain this end shrinks neither from trouble nor danger, is thoroughly analogous to the pains with which, for his satisfaction, a man carefully chooses a woman with definite qualities which appeal to him individually, and strives so eagerly after her that in order to attain this end, he often sacrifices his own happiness in life, contrary to all reason, by a foolish marriage, by love affairs which cost him wealth, honor, and life, even by crimes such as adultery or rape, all merely in order to serve the species in the most efficient way, although at the cost of the individual, in accordance with the will of nature, which is everywhere sovereign. Instinct, in fact, is always an act which seems to be in accordance with the conception of an end, and yet is entirely without such a conception. Nature implants it wherever the acting individual is incapable of understanding the end, or would be unwilling to pursue it. Therefore, as a rule, it is given only to the brutes, and indeed especially to the lowest of them, which have least understanding. But almost only in the case we are here considering, it is also given to man, who certainly could understand the end, but would not pursue it with the necessary ardor, that is, even at the expense of his individual welfare. Thus here, as in the case of all instinct, the truth assumes the form of an illusion in order to act upon the will. It is a voluptuous illusion which leads the man to believe he will find a greater pleasure in the arms of a woman whose beauty appeals to him than in those of any other, or which indeed, exclusively directed to a single individual, firmly convinces him that the possession of her will ensure him excessive happiness. Therefore he imagines he is taking trouble and making sacrifices for his own pleasure, while he does so merely for the maintenance of the regular type of the species, or else a quite special individuality, which can only come from these parents, is to attain existence. The character of instinct is here so perfectly present Thus, an action which seems to be in accordance with the conception of an end, and yet is entirely without such conception, that he who is drawn by that illusion often abhors the end which alone guides it, procreation, and would like to hinder it. Thus, it is the case of almost all illicit love affairs. In accordance with the character of the matter which has been explained, every lover will experience a marvelous disillusion after the pleasure he has at last attained, and will wonder that what was so longingly desired accomplishes nothing more than every other sexual satisfaction, so that he does not see himself much benefited by it. That wish was related to all his other wishes, as the species is related to the individual, thus as the infinite to the finite. The satisfaction, on the other hand, is really only for the benefit of the species, and thus does not come within the consciousness of the individual, who, inspired by the will of the species, here served an end with every kind of sacrifice, which was not his own end at all. Hence, then, every lover, after the ultimate consummation of the great work, finds himself cheated, for the illusion has vanished by means of which the individual was here the dupe of the species. As Plato very happily says, voluptas omnium maxime vaniloqua. Pleasure is the greatest impostor of all. But all this reflects light on the instincts and mechanical tendencies of the brutes. They also are, without doubt, involved in a kind of illusion, which deceives them with the prospect of their own pleasure, while they work so laboriously and with so much self-denial for the species. The bird builds its nest, the insect seeks the only suitable place for its eggs, or even hunts for prey which, unsuited for its own enjoyment, must be laid beside the eggs as food for the future larvae. The bees, the wasps, the ants apply themselves to their skillful dwellings and highly complicated economy. They are all guided with certainty by an illusion, which conceals the service of the species under the mask of an egotistical end. This is probably the only way to comprehend the inner or subjective process that lies at the foundation of the manifestations of instinct. Outwardly, however, or objectively, we find in those creatures which are, to a large extent, governed by instinct, especially in insects, a preponderance of the ganglion system, that is, the subjective nervous system, over the objective or cerebral system, from which we must conclude that they are moved not so much by objective proper apprehension as by subjective ideas exciting desire, which arise from the influence of the ganglion system upon the brain, and accordingly by a kind of illusion, and this will be the physiological process in the case of all instinct. For the sake of illustration, I will mention as another example of the instinct in the human species, although a weak one, the capricious appetite of women who are pregnant. It seems to arise from the fact that the nourishment of the embryo sometimes requires a special or definite modification of the blood which flows to it, upon which the food which produces such a modification at once presents itself to the pregnant woman as an object of ardent longing. Thus here also an illusion arises. Accordingly, woman has one instinct more than man, and the ganglion system is also much more developed in the woman. That man has fewer instincts than the brutes, and that even these few can easily be led astray, may be explained from the great preponderance of the brain in his case. The sense of beauty which instinctively guides the selection for the satisfaction of sexual passion is led astray when it degenerates into the tendency to pederasty, analogous to the fact that the blue bottle, Musca vomitora, instead of depositing its eggs according to instinct in putrefying flesh, lays them in the blossom of the Arum dracunculus, deceived by the cadaverous smell of this plant. Now that an instinct entirely directed to that which is to be produced lies at the foundation of all sexual love, will receive complete confirmation from a fuller analysis of it, which we cannot therefore avoid. First of all, we have to remark here that by nature Man is inclined to inconstancy in love, woman to constancy. The love of the man sinks perceptibly from the moment it has obtained satisfaction. Almost every other woman charms him more than the one he already possesses. He longs for variety. The love of the woman, on the other hand, increases just from that moment. This is a consequence of the aim of nature, which is directed to the maintenance and therefore to the greatest possible increase of the species. The man can easily beget over 100 children a year. The woman, on the contrary, with however many men, can yet only bring one child a year into the world, leaving twin births out of account. Therefore the man always looks about after other women. The woman, again, sticks firmly to the one man, for nature moves her, instinctively and without reflection, to retain the nourisher and protector of the future offspring. Accordingly, faithfulness in marriage is, with the man, artificial. With the woman, it is natural, and thus adultery on the part of the woman is much less pardonable than on the part of the man, both objectively, on account of the consequences, and also subjectively, on account of its unnaturalness. So we begin by noting that egoism is very deeply rooted in each individual, the desire to seek my own advantage, my own pleasure, my own interests. And the species, the human species, will use this egoism for its own ends. But, says Schopenhauer, the human intellect, the individual intellect, is not suited to choosing the composition of the next generation. This is a species goal. I'm not going to be able to think through and reliably select the best option available using just my own mind. And so nature, he says, uses an illusion. It produces in each of us the illusion that what is good for the species is in fact good for the individual. And this is the force of instinct. This is what directs our love reactions to different individuals. In this way, Schopenhauer is narrowing the difference between ourselves and the animals, the lower beasts, because we tend to think of ourselves as being above the beasts, as being above instinct. Animals are controlled by instinct, but we have free will. Schopenhauer says this is false. This is an illusion. Sexual attraction in human beings simply is instinct operating in us. Now, from a purely subjective sensation standpoint, says Schopenhauer, the beauty or attractiveness of a partner is irrelevant to satisfying the desire. That is just considered purely as desire and its satisfaction. It doesn't matter whether it's this particular one or that particular one that I'm with. And yet, we observe in ourselves and in people generally that we are, in fact, highly particular and very cautious in selecting our mates. Now, we imagine, each of us, that this is us, me, making a choice according to my own priorities, my own values, my own sense of judgment. But it's exactly here that Schopenhauer says the sense of beauty is the mask that instinct wears. So whom do I admire as beautiful? This is determined by instinct operating in me, and this has two aspects. First, everyone admires the most beautiful members of the human species, the people in whom the species being is impressed most vividly and most successfully. These are the beautiful people. These are the movie stars, the people who are flourishing. Everybody admires them. And then secondly, each one of us will admire the one or the ones whose strengths complement his own deficiencies. And this is just what it means to say that a certain person or a certain type of person is suited to a particular individual. Right? If you have a roommate who's got a certain type of girl, brunettes or heavy girls or whatever it is, it's that suits him is precisely this natural instinct coming to the surface. So nature, recognizing the ways in which I fall short of the species ideal of full human excellence, implants in me a desire for a woman who is strong in just those elements. And this is the one that I will regard as beautiful. All along throughout this process, I will suppose that I'm merely seeking what's most pleasant to me, that I'm directing my choices, I'm making my actions, I am the one who is seeking my own pleasure, my own interests, according to my own personal history and choices and judgments about what I value.
But in reality, I'm rather like a small child in a shopping cart, turning his little plastic steering wheel while the parent is actually pushing the entire thing. The parent in this situation is nature. Nature is determining where we go, and I'm sitting here pretending to myself that I'm doing something that's actually has some sort of causal effect upon the choices that I make and the attractions that I feel. So instinct directs each one of us to act individually for the benefit of the species. So we are, we're acting for the sake of humanity while sort of being subjectively fooled by this illusion that we are each of us seeking our own personal happiness. Without instinct, says Schopenhauer, we would not be able to pursue the eugenic reproductive end with sufficient ardor, he says, with sufficient enthusiasm and determination, nor would we be willing to sacrifice our own personal happiness for it. Okay. This is a remarkable observation, I think, that why is it that these judgments of beauty and the love and attractiveness are so instinctive? It's because if they were rational and intellectual, if we didn't have this instinct to push us towards pursuing both beautiful women in general and this particular woman that seems to be highly suited to me, we wouldn't pursue the end that nature requires with sufficient force, and we wouldn't be willing to make sufficient sacrifices for it. And I think here's a place where we, as people in the early 21st century, can reflect upon the reality today, globally, of falling birth rates. I might say, in consonance with Schopenhauer's theory, this is part of what happens when we gain more intellectual and deliberate individual control over our reproductive capacities. That we continue having children, just fewer of them, and we don't pursue the same, since instinct's no longer fully in charge, we don't pursue the eugenic power, the eugenic function of instinct nearly as well or as consistently across the board at scale as we had back when love affairs were directed by instinct alone, and people didn't have access to birth control methods and reproductive technologies, which placed these things much more under the dominion of individual will and choice. He has a great line here. He says, "In instinct, the truth assumes the form of an illusion in order to act upon the will." So the truth that we need to serve here about the composition of the future human race takes on the form of an illusion, that this particular woman is beautiful and attractive and just the one for me. Why are we being lied to? Why are we being deceived? It's in order that the truth can act more effectively upon our will. That's what instinct is and what instinct does. Furthermore, says Schopenhauer, the love that one feels for the beloved persists even when and even while I might reject and seek to avoid the end of procreation. He says this explains most illicit love affairs. And it might be helpful to people at a time of ubiquitous access to birth control to think about how strong people's passion for one another must have been in order for them to pursue and consummate a love affair, knowing of the risks that brought about. And Schopenhauer is appealing to the sort of power that is overwhelming people's better judgment in cases like this. Well, what explains it? It's that nature is forcing this upon us with this illusion that it generates in our minds. He says also, I'm going to try to be a little bit delicate here, he says also that this explains the disillusion that we feel afterwards. I should add here, he's speaking, I think, primarily to and for men, and I'm just going to take that as an assumption. It explains the disillusionment that we feel when we might ask ourselves, what was it that was so very important to me an hour ago that I was willing to, compromise my entire life plan for it? What I've got is pretty good, I might say, but it doesn't seem like it was worth as much as it seemed to be worth even just a short time ago. Whence came this madness of passion that precedes and drives on this sexual pursuit? My best explanation for this in terms of Schopenhauer's metaphysics is this. In metaphysical terms, what he wanted, the lover now who feels disillusioned, what he wanted was the infinite. which he can never experience as an individual. The individual just cannot contain the infinite. He can long for it and reach for it and strive and lunge for it, but can never possess it. That's sort of a fundamental lesson, I think, of Schopenhauer's Metaphysics of Will. And this explains the disappointment with the pleasure that he got. He's got the pleasure, and the pleasure is a finite thing, and it's interesting and good, but it's not the infinite for which he longed. And it was his sacrifices were premised upon this sort of longing for the infinite. Right? Why would a man be willing to throw his life away for the possession of a single woman? Well, it's because at the time, right, nature is driving him on and holding in front of him, right, the lure of the infinite, and infinite satisfaction, which no single individual, as will, ever ultimately achieves. So I think that's my best attempt. If the infinite stuff doesn't make any sense to you, then just ignore that. That's the best I can do. In sexual encounters, the individual, Schopenhauer says, is the dupe of the species. That's another good line. Right? We are, in a sense, being sort of duped or fooled and played around with by the human race. A couple of interesting observations come towards the end of this section. Schopenhauer says that in light of this theory, we can and should reevaluate our view of animals and their instincts and what it's like for them to be in the grip of some instinctive drive. Everything from ants through birds up to dogs, right, and other animals. We might tend to be a little bit superior about our rationality and our intellect and say, well, the animals are driven by instinct, but we have intellect which cancels out instinct and allows us to choose freely and to pursue our own ends. But here's an alternate story to tell. Maybe the animal's obedience to what objectively seen is instinct may be driven by a certain subjective pleasure, a certain kind of mental subjectivity of, for example, the dog. Right? My dog, I'll take my dog on a walk. My dog strains at the leash wanting to pursue a squirrel. The squirrel is 30 yards away and right next to a tree. There is no chance on earth my dog is going to actually catch the squirrel, even if she did. It wouldn't satisfy the kind of intense longing that she has. But I might look at the dog and say, well, the dog's in the grip of an instinct, poor dog. It has no inner life. But what if I say this? What if I say the dog is experiencing something analogous to what I experience, what all human beings experience in sexual love, sexual desire? It is longing for, it has a sort of subjective mental direction towards the object, the squirrel. I want that squirrel, the dog says. I've got to have that squirrel right now. Okay? It's living through this kind of the subjectivity of, maybe it may be living through, this is all speculative. The dog might be experiencing as a kind of subjective longing for pleasure of an instinct or of objective instinct. So another example of this, think of a bird building a nest. We say, the bird is like sort of programmed robotically to build its nest in just this way, in just this location. But perhaps the bird has a kind of inner life, right? It's taking pleasure in building its nest in just this way. It may even be saying to itself, I've made some fantastic choices about the siting and the composition of this nest. I've got this just coming along really, really well. I'm having a very successful nest building experience. I'm taking all sorts of pleasure and joy in my building my nest in just this way. Seen from outside, we say, well, it does what it does because instinct, species being, forces it to do this. But perhaps there is a way we can think of towards a general theory of what it's like, a general account of the subjectivity of instinct-driven beings, recognizing that we are instinct-driven beings in respect to this most significant of behaviors, sexual behavior, choosing the composition of the next generation. Okay. Schopenhauer gives another example of this, which he says is a weak example, but it is one that everybody will be familiar with, just about. The bizarre food cravings of pregnant women. Right? This is in humans, but sometimes, I've seen this in my own lifetime with my wife and our children, sometimes pregnant women will develop a craving for some particular food, pickles or some combination of food, that is somewhat bizarre and unusual, which they've never wanted before and never want again. And Schopenhauer says, well, this obviously indicates that, objectively speaking, the fetus needs some nutrient that's present only in the craved food, and this gets translated somehow into a deeply rooted, not deeply rooted, a very strong, ardent, although temporary, desire, subjective desire on the part of the pregnant woman for that particular food. I have to have it. Go get it for me, she says to me. So I have to run out to the store to get whatever it is that my wife is craving. Maybe it's blue cheese. Maybe it's pickles and ice cream. I don't know. There's sort of cultural legends about this, right? Women and their bizarre cravings. The craving goes away as quickly as it manifests once it's satisfied. And I think, interestingly for me, is that Schopenhauer, I think, is stating what's pretty close to conventional wisdom today. We don't fully understand it, but there's some kind of some kind of objective nutritional need on the part of the baby signals to the woman, not an intellectual recognition that, oh, it's time for me to eat this, but activates this subjective desire, which can be very, very strong, right? I have to consume this kind of food right now in the very near future. That feeling is something analogous then to the way in which nature operates in us with this kind of lie that we need to have this to serve the instinct, the objective interests of nature and of instinct. We are given these deceptive, subjective impressions or desires. The sense of beauty, Schopenhauer also says, can become degenerate. It degenerates in human beings, human men, adult men anyway, into pederasty. I'm not going to say much more about that. I will note that the third edition of this book, Schopenhauer added an appendix to this chapter on pederasty, and I will read that and comment on it. That will be the final entry in this series, so watch out for that. He concludes this part with some final comments, before which he says, a fuller analysis of human sexual behavior will confirm his theory. We're going to look at more and more what he thinks are facts in the world about human behavior that will indicate and show more completely how he's fundamentally right about this, he thinks. A couple of final remarks he makes. He observes that men are more inclined to infidelity than women. We might also say promiscuity. I don't see that anything he says about infidelity here wouldn't apply just as well to promiscuity. The reason, he says, is because of the different reproductive capacities of the sexes. Men can father hundreds of children a year, women at most one per year. The result of this is that psychologically women instinctively seek security for their single offspring, which is very rare and thus high value, where men would seek variety to, as the old expression went, to sow their wild oats. His conclusion then, looking at this natural sort of the psychology that goes along with this natural fact, is that female adultery, legally as well as morally, I think, would for him be more worthy of punishment. And this is for both objective reasons, because it does more damage to the human species as a whole, and subjectively speaking, because in choosing it, each woman violates what is the instinct of the feminine, that is towards security and fidelity to a single man. I know people have different opinions about this, and passions run high on it. You may think Schopenhauer is completely wrong about that, and you're welcome to think so. I'm not going to try to defend or criticize him on this point. Just note that this is the place where he brings this particular part of the chapter to a close. I want to look forward to the next section in the next video. Schopenhauer is going to begin to categorize the factors that influence the working of this sexual instinct. First, he's going to talk about general species factors which operate on all of us, and that's the topic of the fourth section, which we'll look at in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. The Metaphysics of Sexual Love, Part 4. Want of understanding does a man no harm with women. Indeed, extraordinary mental endowment, or even genius, might sooner influence them unfavorably as an abnormality. Hence one often sees an ugly, stupid, and coarse fellow get the better of a cultured, able, and amiable man with women. In this section, Schopenhauer catalogues the general species factors that influence our feelings of love for the opposite sex. These are the physical factors that cause us to see a potential mate as beautiful. He gets very specific here, so everyone, I think, will find something to either agree or disagree with. Here's what Schopenhauer writes.
But in order to be thorough and gain full conviction that the pleasure in the other sex, however objective it may seem to us, is yet merely disguised instinct, that is, sense of the species, which strives to maintain its type, we must investigate more fully the considerations which guide us in this pleasure, and enter into the details of this, rarely as these details, which will have to be mentioned here, may have figured in a philosophical work before. These considerations divide themselves into those which directly concern the type of the species, that is, beauty, those which are concerned with physical qualities, and lastly, those which are merely relative, which arise from the requisite correction or neutralization of the one-sided qualities and abnormalities of the two individuals by each other. We shall go through them one by one. The first consideration which guides our choice and inclination is age. In general, we accept the age from the years when menstruation begins to those when it ceases. Yet we give the decided preference to the period from the 18th to the 28th year. Outside of those years, on the other hand, no woman can attract us. An old woman, that is, one who no longer menstruates, excites our aversion. Youth without beauty has still always attraction. Beauty without youth has none. Clearly, the unconscious end which guides us here is the possibility of reproduction in general. Therefore, every individual loses attraction for the opposite sex in proportion as he or she is removed from the fittest period for begetting or conceiving. The second consideration is that of health. Acute diseases only temporarily disturb us. Chronic diseases or cachexia repel us because they are transmitted to the child. The third consideration is the skeleton, because it is the basis of the type of the species. Next to age and disease, nothing repels us so much as a deformed figure. Even the most beautiful face cannot atone for it. On the contrary, even the ugliest face, when accompanied by a straight figure, is unquestionably preferred. Further, we feel every disproportion of the skeleton most strongly. For example, a stunted, dumpy, short-boned figure, and many such, also a halting gait, where it is not the result of an extraneous accident. On the other hand, a strikingly beautiful figure can make up for all defects. It enchants us. Here also comes in the great value which all attach to the smallness of the feet. It depends upon the fact that they are an essential characteristic of the species, for no animal has the tarsus and the metatarsus taken together so small as man, which accords with his upright walk. He is a plantigrade. Accordingly, Jesus Sirach also says, "A woman with a straight figure and beautiful feet is like columns of gold in sockets of silver." The teeth are also important because they are essential for nourishment and quite specially hereditary. The fourth consideration is a certain fullness of flesh, thus a predominance of the vegetative function, of plasticity, because this promises abundant nourishment for the fetus. Hence great leanness repels us in a striking degree. A full female bosom exerts an exceptional charm upon the male sex, because, standing in direct connection with the female functions of propagation, it promises abundant nourishment to the newborn child. On the other hand, excessively fat women excite our disgust. The cause is that this indicates atrophy of the uterus, thus barrenness, which is not known by the head, but by instinct. The last consideration of all is the beauty of the face. Here also, before everything else, the bones are considered. Therefore, we look principally for a beautiful nose, and a short turned-up nose spoils everything. A slight inclination of the nose downwards or upwards has decided the happiness in life of innumerable maidens, and rightly so, for it concerns the type of the species. A small mouth, by means of small maxillae, is very essential as specifically characteristic of the human countenance, as distinguished from the muzzle of the brutes. A receding, or as it were cut-away chin, is especially disagreeable, because mentum prominulum is an exclusive characteristic of our species. Finally comes the regard for beautiful eyes and forehead. It is connected with the psychical qualities, especially the intellectual, which are inherited from the mother. The unconscious considerations which, on the other hand, the inclination of women follows naturally, cannot be so exactly assigned. In general, the following may be asserted. They give the preference to the age from 30 to 35 years, especially over that of youths who yet really present the height of human beauty. The reason is that they are not guided by taste, but by instinct, which recognizes, in the age named, the acme of reproductive power. In general, they look less to beauty, especially of the face. It is as if they took it upon themselves alone to impart this to the child. They are principally won by the strength of the man, and the courage which is connected with this, for these promise the production of stronger children, and also a brave protector for them. Every physical defect of the man, every divergence from the type, may, with regard to the child, be removed by the woman in reproduction, through the fact that she herself is blameless in these respects, or even exceeds in the opposite direction. Only those qualities of the man have to be accepted which are peculiar to his sex, and which therefore the mother cannot give to the child. Such are the manly structure of the skeleton, broad shoulders, slender hips, straight bones, muscular power, courage, beard, etc. Hence it arises that women often love ugly men, but never an unmanly man, because they cannot neutralize his defects. The second class of considerations, which lie at the foundation of sexual love, are those which regard psychical qualities. Here we shall find that the woman is throughout attracted by the qualities of the heart or character in the man, as those which are inherited from the father. The woman is won especially by firmness of will, decision, and courage, and perhaps also by honesty and good-heartedness. On the other hand, intellectual gifts exercise no direct and instinctive power over her, just because they are not inherited from the father. Want of understanding does a man no harm with women. Indeed, extraordinary mental endowment or even genius might sooner influence them unfavorably as an abnormality. Hence one often sees an ugly, stupid, and coarse fellow get the better of a cultured, able, and amiable man with women. Also, marriages from love are sometimes consummated between natures which are mentally very different. For example, the man is rough, powerful, and stupid. The woman, tenderly sensitive, delicately thoughtful, cultured, aesthetic, etc. Or, the man is a genius and learned, the woman a goose. Sic visum veneri, cui placet impares, formas atque animus subjuga aenia, sevo metere cum ioco. Venus makes it so. Precisely what does not work in neither soul nor body, she brings under the same yoke and laughs about it. The reason is that here quite other considerations than the intellectual predominate, those of instinct. In marriage, what is looked to is not intellectual entertainment, but the production of children. It is a bond of the heart, not of the head. It is a vain and absurd pretense when women assert that they have fallen in love with the mind of a man, or else it is the overstraining of a degenerate nature. Men, on the other hand, are not determined in their instinctive love by the qualities of character of the woman. Hence, so many Socrateses have found their Xanthipes, for example, Shakespeare, Albrecht Dürer, Byron, etc. The intellectual qualities, however, certainly influence here because they are inherited from the mother. Yet their influence is easily outweighed by that of physical beauty, which acts directly as concerning a more essential point. However, it happens, either from the feeling or the experience of that influence, that mothers have their daughters taught the fine arts, languages, and so forth in order to make them attractive to men, whereby they wish to assist the intellect by artificial means, just as, in case of need, they assist the hips and the bosom. Observe that here we are speaking throughout only of that entirely immediate, instinctive attraction from which alone love, properly so called, grows. that a woman of culture and understanding prizes understanding and intellect in a man, that a man from rational reflection should test and have regard to the character of his bride, has nothing to do with the matter with which we are dealing here. Such things lie at the bottom of a rational choice in marriage, but not of the passionate love, which is our theme.
Schopenhauer's catalog of factors involved in sexual attraction proceeds in a couple of different sections. He first talks about physical factors, which men, considering first men and then women, and then he talks about psychological factors, considering first women and then men. So we'll run through these in order. Begins first with physical factors which cause men to find women beautiful. He says the first factor, there are 5 factors involved here. The first is youth, ideally the ages of 18 to 28. In women, he thinks this is obviously linked to reproductive ability, to fertility, and the ability to have healthy children. The second factor in a woman is health, he says, especially that she be obviously free from any heritable diseases. Again, his idea here is to do a kind of 19th century sociobiology to try to show us how these physical factors affect these seemingly subjective evaluations of, sort of instinctive passions of love. Third factor, he says, the skeleton, the frame, generally, whether the spine is straight, etc., because this is central to bodily health of the individual and also to the health of the species. He mentions here in passing the value in women of small feet and of good teeth. The feet, I don't know about. The teeth obviously might be connected to the ability to acquire nutrition in order to remain healthy one's whole life. The fourth factor, he says, the translator gives us here a certain fleshiness, but not too fat. He says not too lean, but not over. The fourth factor, he says, is, as the translator puts it, a certain fullness of flesh, a certain fleshiness that goes beyond being lean and skinny, but not so far as to being obese or too fat. He then mentions also, finally, what we might have thought one might have begun with, the face, the beauty of the face. Especially, he says, the bones of the face, having a well-shaped nose. He gives us some distinctive opinions here, which might, again, be more revealing of Schopenhauer's preferences than of what's generally true for all men at all places and times. What would be involved in a well-shaped nose, a small mouth, and he dwells especially on the fact that women should not have a weak chin. A weak chin would be something that virtually every man would find to be a defect in a woman. And then finally says the eyes and the forehead, perhaps because the forehead also would, beautiful forehead would indicate superior intellectual qualities in a woman. And Schopenhauer is convinced that the intellectual qualities of a child, of any person, are inherited from his mother's side. So a woman of good intellectual quality would pass this on to her children. Some of you who know Schopenhauer's biography also know that his mother was a well-known novelist and author of travelogues, a woman of great intellectual power. He then moves on to factors that make men seem beautiful to women. These, he said, are harder to pin down, but he makes a couple of attempts. He says, in age, women tend to prefer men who are between the ages of 30 and 35. He indicates this is kind of the peak reproductive ability of men. Women place less emphasis upon the beauty of the face, but they do value strength in a man, which can be shown by his courage. This is valuable both because it could be inherited by the children. It also gives to the children a strong protector. He has in this section one of my favorite lines from this part of the chapter. He says, women can love an ugly man, but never an unmanly man. I'm sure there's plenty of more work that could be done to fill out just what is meant by that. Schopenhauer here, much less detailed, and I don't know what his sources are for this, for speculating about women's preferences. Worth noting, perhaps, that youth is not important to women, but other youth and beauty are important to men, but not to women. Strength, power, certain being in the kind of the prime of life, later into the 30s, is more important to women. Dealing here just with instincts, not with a sort of hard and fast rule that applies to everyone at all places and times. Schopenhauer then moves on to psychological factors which attract the sexes to each other, beginning first with women. Women, he says, are attracted to the qualities of character in a man. And among these, he names firmness of will, sort of singleness of purpose and ability to carry out one's plans, courage, honesty, and good-heartedness. He says women have no instinctive attraction to a man's intellectual qualities. They may find them attractive, but it's not sort of hard-coded into them at the level of instinct the way that some of these other factors are. And he says this is the explanation why it's often the case that a coarse and stupid man will do quite well with women, including very smart, very intelligent women. Women aren't, we might say, they aren't filtering for intellectual ability when they are sort of instinctively attracted to this man and not that man. Another good quote from this section: in marriage, Schopenhauer writes, what is looked to is not intellectual entertainment, but the production of children. So at the level of instinct, at the level of will, what's operating in women in being attracted to men and finding men attractive is this biological imperative that will direct the production of excellent children, not the ability to have stimulating and pleasing conversations with an intellectual peer. That may come in, but it's going to come in at a later sort of non-instinctive, sort of higher level that's added on at a higher level of cognition and of character and of attraction. So this is what directs our instinctive attractions, not our reflective choices. He then speaks briefly about the psychological factors that direct men to be attracted to specific women. As the converse of the previous principle, he notes that men are not attracted by the qualities of women's character. That's not what they're looking for kind of at an instinctive level in women. They are, however, attracted by women's intellectual qualities. This deals with Schopenhauer's almost obsession, I would say, with his idea that intellectual qualities are inherited from the mother and qualities of character or will are inherited from the father. He's very dedicated over a long period of time to trying to establish this principle by observing famous historical figures, for example. But he says even these psychological factors in men's choices and attractions to mates are easily overwhelmed by the physical factors, which are more immediate and far more important in directing their passions. But the fact that intellect and not character is attractive to men influences mothers to educate their daughters in the fine arts. This is in order to provide a kind of assistance to them in attracting a man. And he ends this section with a reminder that we're speaking here only about the immediate instinctive attraction to a member of the opposite sex, not about any kind of rational behavior and planned choices that we make. This is about explaining how we feel, not about how we act sort of in a considered, deliberate way towards people when considering marrying this or that this person and not that person. This is more about what the heart says. So he's trying to give us a kind of walk through what he thinks is happening in the heart of men and in the heart of women when they have these passions for one another in terms of both physical and psychological factors. In the next section of this chapter, Schopenhauer is going to turn to the individual factors, how each person's instincts push them towards a mate who makes up for their own deficiencies. So we'll look at that in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.
The Metaphysics of Sexual Love, Part 5. I may here express my opinion in passing that the white color of the skin is not natural to man, but that by nature he has a black or brown skin, like our forefathers the Hindus. Previously, Schopenhauer has discussed the general species factors that govern sexual attraction, both physical and psychological, for both men and women. In this section, he goes into the relative factors that influence each individual's instinctive judgment in the matter. The guiding principle, he says, is that each loves what he lacks. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. Hitherto I have only taken account of the absolute considerations, that is, those which hold good for everyone. I come now to the relative considerations, which are individual, because in their case what is looked to is the rectification of the type of the species, which is already defectively presented, the correction of the divergences from it, which the chooser's own person already bears in itself, and thus the return to the pure presentation of the type. Here, then, each one loves what he lacks. Starting from the individual constitution and directed to the individual constitution, the choice which rests upon such relative considerations is much more definite, decided, and exclusive than that which proceeds merely from the absolute considerations. Therefore, the source of really passionate love will lie, as a rule, in these relative considerations, and only that of the ordinary and slighter inclination in the absolute considerations. Accordingly, it is not generally precisely correct and perfect beauties that kindle great passions. For such a truly passionate inclination to arise, something is required which can only be expressed by a chemical metaphor. Two persons must neutralize each other, like acid and alkali, to a neutral salt. The essential conditions demanded for this are the following. First, all sex is one-sided. This one-sidedness is more distinctly expressed in one individual than in another. Therefore, in every individual it can be better supplemented and neutralized by one than by another individual of the opposite sex. For each one requires a one-sidedness which is the opposite of his own to complete the type of humanity in the new individual that is to be produced, the constitution of which is always the goal towards which all tends. Physiologists know that manhood and womanhood admit of innumerable degrees, through which the former sinks to the repulsive gynander and hypospideus, and the latter rises to the graceful androgyne. From both sides complete hermaphrodism can be reached, at which point stand those individuals who, holding the exact mean between the two sexes, can be attributed to neither, and consequently are unfit to propagate the species. Accordingly, the neutralization of two individualities by each other, of which we are speaking, demands that the definite degree of his manhood shall exactly correspond to the definite degree of her womanhood, so that the one-sidedness of each exactly annuls that of the other. Accordingly, the most manly man will seek the most womanly woman, and vice versa. And in the same way, every individual will seek another corresponding to him or her in degree of sex. Now, how far the required relation exists between two individuals is instinctively felt by them, and, together with the other relative considerations, lies at the foundation of the higher degrees of love. While, therefore, the lovers speak pathetically of the harmony of their souls, the heart of the matter is, for the most part, the agreement or suitableness pointed out here, with reference to the being which is to be produced, and its perfection, and which is also clearly of much more importance than the harmony of their souls, which often, not long after the marriage, resolves itself into a howling discord. Now here come in the further relative considerations, which depend upon the fact that everyone endeavors to neutralize by means of the other his weaknesses, defects, and deviations from the type, so that they will not perpetuate themselves or even develop into complete abnormalities in the child which is to be produced. The weaker a man is as regards muscular power, the more will he seek for strong women, and the woman on her side will do the same. But since now a less degree of muscular power is natural and regular in the woman, women, as a rule, will give the preference to strong men. Further, the size is an important consideration. Little men have a decided inclination for big women, and vice versa. And indeed, in a little man, the preference for big women will be so much the more passionate if he himself was begotten by a big father, and only remains little through the influence of his mother, because he has inherited from his father the vascular system and its energy, which was able to supply a large body with blood. If, on the other hand, his father and grandfather were both little, that inclination will make itself less felt. At the foundation of the aversion of a big woman to big men lies the intention of nature to avoid too big a race, if, with the strength which this woman could impart to them, they would be too weak to live long. If, however, such a woman selects a big husband, perhaps for the sake of being more presentable in society, then, as a rule, her offspring will have to atone for her folly. Further, the consideration as to the complexion is very decided. Blondes prefer dark persons or brunettes, but the latter seldom prefer the former. The reason is that fair hair and blue eyes are in themselves a variation from the type, almost an abnormity, analogous to white mice, or at least to gray horses. In no part of the world, not even in the vicinity of the pole, are they indigenous, except in Europe, and are clearly of Scandinavian origin. I may here express my opinion in passing that the white color of the skin is not natural to man, but that by nature he has a black or brown skin, like our forefathers the Hindus, and that consequently a white man has never originally sprung from the womb of nature, and that thus there is no such thing as a white race, much as this is talked of, but every white man is a faded or bleached one. Forced into the strange world where he only exists like an exotic plant, and like this requires in winter the hothouse, in the course of thousands of years man became white. The gypsies, an Indian race which immigrated only about 4 centuries ago, show the transition from the complexion of the Hindu to our own. Footnote. The fuller discussion of this subject will be found in the Perversion, Volume 2, Section 92 of the first edition, second edition, pages 167 to 170. Therefore, in sexual love, nature strives to return to dark hair and brown eyes as the primitive type, but the white color of the skin has become a second nature, though not so that the brown of the Hindu repels us. Finally, each one also seeks in the particular parts of the body the corrective of his own defects and aberrations, and does so the more decidedly the more important the part is. Therefore, snub-nosed individuals have an inexpressible liking for hook noses, parrot faces, and it is the same with regard to all other parts. Men with excessively slim, long bodies and limbs can find beauty in a body which is even beyond measure stumpy and short. The considerations with regard to temperament act in an analogous manner. Each will prefer the temperament opposed to his own, yet only in proportion as his one is decided. Whoever is himself in some respect very perfect does not indeed seek and love imperfection in this respect, but is yet more easily reconciled to it than others, because he himself insures the children against great imperfection of this part. For example, whoever is himself very white will not object to a yellow complexion, but whoever has the latter will find dazzling whiteness divinely beautiful. The rare case in which a man falls in love with a decidedly ugly woman occurs when, besides the exact harmony of the degree of sex explained above, the whole of her abnormalities are precisely the opposite, and thus the corrective, of his. The love is then wont to reach a high degree. The profound seriousness with which we consider and ponder each bodily part of the woman, and she on her part does the same, the critical scrupulosity with which we inspect a woman who begins to please us, the capriciousness of our choice, the keen attention with which the bridegroom observes his betrothed, his carefulness not to be deceived in any part, and the great value which he attaches to every excess or defect in the essential parts, all this is quite in keeping with the importance of the end. For the new being to be produced will have to bear through its whole life a similar part. For example, if the woman is only a little crooked, this may easily impart to her son a hump, and so in all the rest. Consciousness of all this certainly does not exist. On the contrary, everyone imagines that he makes that careful selection in the interest of his own pleasure, which at bottom cannot be interested in it at all, but he makes it precisely as, under the presupposition of his own corporization, is most in keeping with the interest of the species, to maintain the type of which as pure as possible is the secret task. The individual acts here, without knowing it, by order of something higher than itself, the species. Hence the importance which it attaches to things which may and indeed must be indifferent to itself as such. There is something quite peculiar in the profound unconscious seriousness with which two young persons of opposite sex who see each other for the first time regard each other, in the searching and penetrating glance they cast at one another, in the careful review which all the features and parts of their respective persons have to endure. This investigating and examining is the meditation of the genius of the species on the individual which is possible through these two and the combination of its qualities. According to the result of this meditation is the degree of their pleasure in each other and their yearning for each other. This yearning, even after it has attained a considerable degree, may be suddenly extinguished again by the discovery of something that had previously remained unobserved. In this way, then, the genius of the species meditates concerning the coming race in all who are capable of reproduction. The nature of this race is the great work with which Cupid is occupied, unceasingly active, speculating and pondering. In comparison with the importance of his great affair, which concerns the species and all coming races, the affairs of individuals in their whole ephemeral totality are very trifling. Therefore, he is always ready to sacrifice these regardlessly. For he is related to them as an immortal to mortals, and his interests to theirs as infinite to finite. Thus, in the consciousness of managing affairs of a higher kind than all those which only concern individual weal or woe, he carries them on sublimely, undisturbed in the midst of the tumult of war, or in the bustle of business life, or during the raging of a plague, and pursues them even into the seclusion of the cloister. In love, Schopenhauer tells us, individual and relative factors dominate our feelings, and so the greatest objective beauty does not necessarily inspire the greatest passion. This would be a mistake that we could easily make. We could assume that if we just rank women according to objective beauty and attractiveness, the one who is nearest to the ideal will attract the strongest affection of virtually all men, and then less attractive women will be attractive according to how they approach that objective ideal. But this is manifestly not the case in human behavior, and Schopenhauer's theory, he thinks, explains why. All sexuality, he says, is one-sidedness. It is, as it were, being imbalanced or in need of a complement. Therefore, each one of us has a unique set of needs, we might say, which are best met by an exactly complementary lover, like a puzzle piece with ins and outs that needs its exact match with ins and outs in just the opposite way. So the subconscious aim of nature in all of this is to complete or rebalance human nature in our offspring. And keep in mind, this is a pre-genetic, pre-Darwin attempt to give an account of the material factors or the metaphysical factors that drive human subjective sexual attraction. So Schopenhauer says that in pursuit of this rebalancing of human nature in the offspring, the masculine seeks out the feminine of equal degree. So the most masculine man will seek out the most feminine woman. People of lesser degrees of masculinity and femininity will seek out each other. So -4 seeks +4, +9 seeks -9, so that they are matched in their degree. But opposites, this is so that they will come together most completely at 0, with where he compares this to the interaction of an acid and a base, chemical reaction to neutralize each other to bring back wholeness and balance. The lovers would, he suggests here at the middle that those
people, hermaphrodites and such, who are at the exact middle in terms of masculinity and femininity, are repulsive to both sides and are, he thinks, not fit to breed. They're not going to play any part in the constitution of the next generation of the human race, which was pretty hard on them. Lovers may think and speak of the harmony of their souls, right? I've found my soulmate, the one who truly understands me. We're fitted for each other, we're meant for each other. But what's really going on here, says Schopenhauer, is nature, instinct, through instinct, is seeking balance through a combination of complementary factors in order to produce the healthiest offspring. It's all about the offspring. It's not at all about the subjective feelings of enjoyment of the lovers. This offspring result, the constitution of the next generation, is both more important and longer lasting than marital concord, the fact that we get along with each other, that we find joy or happiness subjectively in each other's company. And Schopenhauer says that's indicated by the fact that this often disappears after marriage and children. Why? Because it wasn't really about the subjective enjoyment of each other. It wasn't about our individual or joint happiness. It was about producing a child of a certain character. Now that that goal has been achieved, nature will just, if she wishes, just drop the subjective enjoyment factor. That was merely a tool for nature to achieve its goal, says Schopenhauer. He says each of us seeks a mate who can correct our own weaknesses in the next generation. These could be weaknesses of strength or size, etc. And he goes through 4 or 5 different categories. First, he talks about size. And he says, maybe a little bit clumsily, small men are attracted to large women. Not large men to large women, because if that happened too much, the human race would grow too large. There would be problems there. In terms of complexion, he has some interesting things to say. Blondes, he says, prefer, or a more recent translation says, always demand brown or black-haired lovers. But brunettes seldom prefer blondes. That doesn't seem to track with at least 20th century American pop culture, blondes have more fun, etc., etc. Gentlemen prefer blondes. That was the title of a movie with Marilyn Monroe, wasn't it? Then he has this kind of bizarre interlude. Almost seems like kind of a out of left field social media take or Reddit post that blonde hair, blue eyes, and white skin. Okay, I'll just mention, full disclosure, all 3 of those I have, are unnatural. They're an unnatural state of the human person due to what I might call evolution in the cold North European climate. So the white person with blonde hair and blue eyes is kind of like a hothouse flower that needs to be kept indoors in the wintertime. Man, says Schopenhauer, is naturally brown, like the Indians, or maybe a little bit closer to Europe, the gypsies. It may be that he thinks in the background that this explains why brown skin and brown hair, dark skin and dark hair, is genetically dominant in mixed marriages. This would be nature then seeking to return to the original natural type of man. This is one of the more bizarre kind of tangents that I've ever seen Schopenhauer go off on in the middle of a chapter, but there it is. He speaks also, in addition to size and complexion, of the parts of the body. Each person will seek to mitigate or to improve in a mate the parts of the body, he mentions nose or legs, which are deficient in him. So if my limbs are long and scrawny, I might seek somebody with shorter, stumpy, or more muscular limbs. I would instinctively find that attractive. This is not a matter of me sort of rationally thinking out what do I need. This is nature working through me to cause me to find these factors attractive in a potential lover. He mentions also temperament. Each person seeks an opposite temperament from his own of similar degree, whether great or slight. So a very acerbic person might seek out somebody who's just the opposite to a great degree. People with temperaments closer to the median might seek people who are only slightly on the opposite side, in the opposite direction, but only to a smaller degree. He wraps this section up by saying that someone who is close to natural perfection in some factor of temperament, of body parts, of complexion, etc., will more easily tolerate deviation from it in a lover, in a potential mate, a potential fellow parent, because he will know instinctively that his own contribution to their offspring would dilute that deviation's effect. Something in me, again, not at the rational conscious level, but subconsciously, would tell me it's okay that this person is farther from the perfection, the median point, because I'm already pretty close to it. So when we average them out, we're going to come out, the children will come out fairly close. He gives also here the case of a man who is in love with a very, very ugly woman, a decidedly ugly woman. Why is this? If you had this sort of mistaken theory with which we began, that there's a kind of objective standard of beauty and women are attractive according as they approach that standard, you wouldn't be able to explain it. Is a man attracted to a woman who seems to be quite ugly is because she is his precise complement to him in every way. And he says, these are the marriages where you will find a very high degree of passion. Right? Why is he so devoted to her? Why does he find so much pleasure in her company? It is because, I might say, the different ins and outs of the jigsaw pieces fit together most exactly in their two cases. That's the case where you're going to find the highest degree of instinctive passion and sexual attraction between a man and a woman, not of anybody for the perfect or the perfect for the perfect, but of the complement for its exact complement. The more closely matched they are, the stronger their passion for each other will be. Schopenhauer thinks this theory explains the profound seriousness that we bring to evaluating potential mates. This is because the constitution of the next generation is vital, and that motive is a very strong unconscious motive in each of us. Now, at the conscious level, each of us imagines that he's serving his own pleasure, his own desires, right? I find this woman attractive, this type of woman attractive. That's what pleases me most. But strictly speaking, what I find pleasant is irrelevant to nature in achieving its goal. What I find pleasant is a tool that nature uses to get me to get together with, get attracted to, and have children with this particular woman. He says the cautious evaluative looks that potential lovers give to each other, let's say from like across the dance floor when they're first meeting, is the human species meditating on its possible future to be realized through them. So they're not thinking of this at all. This is all at the subconscious, instinctive level. But what's happening instinctively when a boy and a girl are exchanging glances is the human race is contemplating, would this work out well? Is this likely to produce more perfect offspring? If the envisioned future and the envisioned offspring are good, the result is that instinctively they enjoy feelings of attraction and passion and love for each other. Those are the kind of subjective effects or correlatives of them being naturally matched in that way. And Schopenhauer ends this section of the chapter with this extended Cupid metaphor. Cupid, the god of love, the one who shoots people with his arrows and causes them to fall in love quite independently of their own rational choices. Cupid's important concerns are contrasted with our trivial ones. Right? I want to be happy. I want to take pleasure and joy in my wife. Cupid wants something much more vital for the future of the human race and for all of life. He wants to serve will, we might say, by by creating perfection in the next generation of humans. So Cupid is related to us as immortal being to mortal beings, as pursuing an infinite good to a finite good. The finite will always be sacrificed to the infinite. And so it is the case that my happiness in marriage might be sacrificed by nature in making a match for me. Why? Because the goal of the match is to produce the offspring of a certain character. Cupid has higher affairs than individual happiness at stake, and this is going to be pursued by nature, by instinct, in all human circumstances, Schopenhauer says, from the battlefield to conditions of plague into the monastic enclosure, the monastic cloister. We are never free of its pull. That is an element of what it means to be will as a human being, as a human individual, serving, as it were, the species. In the next section of the chapter, Schopenhauer is going to talk about the passion of love as it's experienced in life and expressed through literature. And we'll look at that in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. The Metaphysics of Sexual Love, Part 6. The species alone has infinite life, and therefore is capable of infinite desires, infinite satisfaction, and infinite pain. But these are here imprisoned in the narrow breast of a mortal. No wonder, then, if such a breast seems like to burst, and can find no expression for the intimations of infinite rapture or infinite misery with which it is filled. In this section of the chapter, Schopenhauer discusses additional factors that contribute to the longing of love, and gives examples from history and literature. Here's what he writes.
We have seen in the above that the intensity of love increases with its individualization, because we have shown that the physical qualities of two individuals can be such that, for the purpose of restoring, as far as possible, the type of the species, the one is quite specially and perfectly the completion or supplement of the other, which therefore desires it exclusively. Already in this case a considerable passion arises, which at once gains a nobler and more sublime appearance from the fact that it is directed to an individual object, and to it alone. Thus, as it were, arises at the special order of the species. For the opposite reason, the mere sexual impulse is ignoble, because without individualization it is directed to all, and strives to maintain the species only as regards quantity, with little respect to quality. But the individualizing, and with it the intensity of the love, can reach so high a degree that without its satisfaction all the good things in the world, and even life itself, lose their value. It is then a wish which attains a vehemence which no other wish ever reaches, and therefore makes one ready for any sacrifice, and in case its fulfillment remains unalterably denied, may lead to madness or suicide. At the foundation of such an excessive passion there must lie, besides the considerations we have shown above, still others which we have not thus before our eyes. We must therefore assume that here not only the corporatization, but the will of the man and the intellect of the woman are specially suitable to each other, in consequence of which a perfectly definite individual can be produced by them alone, whose existence the genius of the species has here in view, for reasons which are inaccessible to us, since they lie in the nature of the thing in itself. Or, to speak more exactly, the will to live desires here to objectify itself in a perfectly definite individual, which can only be produced by this father with this mother. This metaphysical desire of the will in itself has primarily no other sphere of action in the series of existences than the hearts of the future parents, which accordingly are seized with this ardent longing, and now imagine themselves to desire on their own account what really for the present has only a purely metaphysical end, that is, an end which lies outside the series of actually existing things. Thus it is the ardent longing to enter existence of the future individual which has first become possible here, a longing which proceeds from the primary source of all being, and exhibits itself in the phenomenal world as the lofty passion of the future parents for each other, paying little regard to all that is outside itself, in fact, as an unparalleled illusion, on account of which such a lover would give up all the good things of this world to enjoy the possession of this woman, who yet can really give him nothing more than any other. That yet it is just this possession that is kept in view here is seen from the fact that even this lofty passion, like all others, is extinguished in its enjoyment, to the great astonishment of those who are possessed by it. It also becomes extinct when, through the woman turning out barren, which according to Hufeland may arise from 19 accidental constitutional defects, the real metaphysical end is frustrated. Just as daily happens in millions of germs trampled underfoot, in which yet the same metaphysical life principle strives for existence, for which there is no other consolation than that an infinity of space, time, and matter, and consequently inexhaustible opportunity for return, stands open to the will to live. The view which is here expounded must once have been present to the mind of Theophrastus Paracelsus, even if only in a fleeting form, though he has not handled this subject, and my whole system of thought was foreign to him, for in quite a different context, and in his desultory manner, he wrote the following remarkable words. Hic sunt quos Deus copulavit, ut eam quae fuit Uriae et David, quamvis ex diametro sic inim sibi humana mens persuadabat, cum justo et legitimo matrimonio pugnaret hoc, sed proctor Salomonem, qui aliunde nasci non potuit, nisi ex Bathsheba conjuncto David semine, quamvis meretrice conjunxit eos Deus. These are the ones the gods brought together, as for instance David and the woman belonging to Uriah. Although this relation, or at least this is what the human mind was persuaded it believed, was diametrically opposed to just and legitimate marriage. But for the sake of Solomon, who could not have been born from anyone else than Bathsheba and the seed of David, God nonetheless brought them together, although in adultery. The longing of love, the chimeros which the poets of all ages are unceasingly occupied with expressing in innumerable forms, and do not exhaust the subject, nay, cannot do it justice, this longing, which attaches the idea of endless happiness to the possession of a particular woman, and unutterable pain to the thought that this possession cannot be attained, this longing and this pain cannot obtain their material from the wants of an ephemeral individual, but they are the sighs of the spirit of the species, which sees here to be won or lost a means for the attainment of its ends which cannot be replaced, and therefore groans deeply. The species alone has infinite life, and therefore is capable of infinite desires, infinite satisfaction, and infinite pain. But these are here imprisoned in the narrow breast of a mortal. No wonder, then, if such a breast seems like to burst, and can find no expression for the intimations of infinite rapture or infinite misery with which it is filled. This, then, affords the materials for all erotic poetry of a sublime kind, which accordingly rises into transcendent metaphors, soaring above all that is earthly. This is the theme of Petrarch, the material for the St. Preux, Werthers, and Jacopo Ortiz, who apart from it could not be understood nor explained. For that infinite esteem for the loved one cannot rest upon some spiritual excellences, or in general upon any objective, real qualities of hers. For one thing, because she is often not sufficiently well known to the lover, as was the case with Petrarch. The spirit of the species alone can see at one glance what worth she has for its ends. And great passions also arise, as a rule, at the first glance. Who ever loved that loved not at first sight? In this regard, a passage in the romance of Guzman de Alfarache by Mateo Alemán, which has been famous for 250 years, is remarkable. No es necesario, para que uno ame, que pase distancia de tiempo, que siga discurso y haga elección, sino que con aquella primera y sola vista, concurran juntamente cierta correspondencia o consonancia, o lo que acá solemos vulgarmente decir, una confrontación de sangre, a que por particular influxo suelen mover las estrellas. For one to love, it is not necessary that much time should pass, that he should set about reflecting and make a choice, but only that at that first and only glance a certain correspondence and consonance should be encountered on both sides, or that which in common life we are wont to call a sympathy of the blood, and to which a special influence of the stars generally impels. Accordingly, the loss of a loved one, through a rival or through death, is also, for the passionate lover, a pain that surpasses all others, just because it is of a transcendental kind, since it affects him not merely as an individual, but attacks him in his essentia aeterna, and the life of the species into whose special will and service he was here called. Hence, jealousy is such torment and so grim, and the surrender of the loved one is the greatest of all sacrifices. A hero is ashamed of all lamentations except the lamentation of love, because in this it is not he, but the species, that laments. In Calderon's Zenobia the Great, there is in the first act a scene between Zenobia and Decius, in which the latter says, Cielos, luego tú me quieres, perdería 100,000 victorias, volviérame, etc. Heavens, so you love me. For this I would give up 100,000 victories, would reform myself, etc. Here, honor, which hitherto outweighed every interest, is beaten out of the field as soon as sexual love, that is, the interest of the species, comes into play, and sees before it a decided advantage. For this is infinitely superior to every interest of mere individuals, however important it may be. Therefore, to this alone, honor, duty, and fidelity yield after they have withstood every other temptation, including the threat of death. In the same way, we find in private life that conscientiousness is in no point so rare as in this. It is here sometimes set aside even by persons who are otherwise honest and just, and adultery is recklessly committed when passionate love, that is, the interest of the species, has mastered them. It even seems as if in this they believed themselves to be conscious of a higher right than the interests of individuals can ever confer, just because they act in the interest of the species. In this reference, Chamfort's remark is worth noticing. When a man and a woman are violently in love with each other, it always seems to me as if the lovers, whatever obstacles may divide them, a spouse, parents, etc., belong to each other by nature and with divine right, whatever the laws and human conventions might say in the matter. Whoever is inclined to be incensed at this should be referred to the remarkable indulgence which the Saviour shows in the Gospel to the woman taken in adultery, in that he also assumes the same guilt in the case of all present. From this point of view, the greater part of the Decameron appears as the mere mocking and jeering of the genius of the species at the rights and interests of individuals which it tramples underfoot. Differences of rank and all similar circumstances, when they oppose the union of passionate lovers, are set aside with the same ease and treated as nothing by the genius of the species, which, pursuing its ends that concern innumerable generations, blows off as spray such human laws and scruples. From the same deep-lying grounds, when the ends of passionate love are concerned, every danger is willingly encountered, and those who are otherwise timorous here become courageous. In plays and novels, also, we see, with ready sympathy, the young persons who are fighting the battle of their love, that is, the interest of the species, gain the victory over their elders, who are thinking only of the welfare of the individuals. For the efforts of the lovers appear to us as much more important, sublime, and therefore right, than anything that can be opposed to them, as the species is more important than the individual. Accordingly, the fundamental theme of almost all comedies is the appearance of the genius of the species with its aims, which are opposed to the personal interest of the individuals presented, and therefore threaten to undermine their happiness. As a rule, it attains its end, which, as in accordance with poetical justice, satisfies the spectator because he feels that the aims of the species are much to be preferred to those of the individual. Therefore, at the conclusion, he leaves the victorious lovers quite confidently, because he shares with them the illusion that they have founded their own happiness, while they have rather sacrificed it to the choice of the species, against the will and foresight of their elders. It has been attempted in single abnormal comedies to reverse the matter and bring about the happiness of the individuals at the cost of the aims of the species. But then the spectator feels the pain which the genius of the species suffers, and is not consoled by the advantages which are thereby assured to the individuals. As examples of this kind, two very well-known little pieces occur to me: The 16-Year-Old Queen and The Marriage of Reason. In tragedies containing love affairs, since the aims of the species are frustrated, the lovers, who were its tools, generally perish also. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, Tancred, Don Carlos, Wallenstein, The Bride of Messina, and many others.
Schopenhauer begins from his observation in the previous section that the desire of two individuals for each other is based on their possession of complementary qualities. So if the complementarity is exact, their mutual passion can be very intense. Now there's a scale of noble to base here. The more individualized this desire is, the more it is for this one specific mate, the more noble is the love. And, on the flip side, the more generalized sexual desire is, the more it is directed at women or men in general, the lower and more base it is. And the reason for this is because sexual desire for any or every member of the opposite sex aims at preserving the species quantitatively only, but the individualized love improves the species qualitatively. That is, we have not only more, but better offspring coming from it. An intense desire proceeding from an individualized match will trigger the lover's willingness to make any sacrifice to be together, even to risking the loss of life itself. Think of a Romeo and Juliet type situation, or people bordering on suicide at the pain of the anticipation of not being able to be together. This is because of the passion coming from this very individualized compatibility match that they have. There are additional factors at work here besides the species and individual factors that have been discussed earlier in this chapter. One of these is that the will of the man, Schopenhauer says, must match the intellect of the woman so that nature can produce their unique offspring, the one who could be produced in no other way. And what's happening here at the level of the thing in itself is that through the lover's will, this fundamental life force, which is the true reality around us and in us and through us, will seeks to create a specific individual that only these two parents can bring about. So here the individuals are the tools of will. Their passions and their thoughts for each other are its instruments. Their longing for what they think is the unique pleasure that the other can give them is ultimately an illusion. Nature will achieve its ends, and the illusion is dispelled once the act is done, Schopenhauer says. He says Paracelsus must have seen something like this. He gives this example commenting on the story of David and Bathsheba. David seduces Bathsheba. They are together in adultery. Why? Because this is the only way to get Solomon. So God wills that Solomon should be born. He has, therefore, in a sense, brought together the adultery of David with Bathsheba. There was no other way for this to be accomplished. The rest of this section is about examples drawn from literature, poetry, and drama. Schopenhauer tells us that the individual expectation of immense bliss at the possession of the lover, of the beloved one, and the immense pain that we feel at separation are ultimately just, this is a great expression, the size of the spirit of the species. And he has a nice metaphor here that he doesn't really push as far as I would like him to have, that the species is capable of infinite life and infinite desire and an infinite pain. So the species being of the human race has this kind of infinity to it, right? It will extend forever in time. And there's a kind of infinite character to its desires. But when these desires are channeled through a finite heart, it's no wonder it feels fit to burst. My image here might be running too much voltage or too much current through a wire, right? The wire heats up and then begins to burn up, right? It consumes itself. Why? It can't handle the stress, the heat, the intensity of the electricity being pushed through it. And that I think I would suggest is another image of kind of what Schopenhauer is talking here about, the way that will, nature, the species, its infinite desire channeled through a finite being, a finite heart and mind and will, like that of a single lover, it overheats, right? It's in danger of burning up and being utterly destroyed. He says this is the driving force behind poetry and drama that draw upon this sexual tension, this dynamic of sexual love and passion. He says further, the admiration that the lover feels for the beloved is not in fact based upon any objective qualities that she possesses. He quotes Shakespeare and some other authors to this effect as well. the loss of the beloved, the prospective loss of the beloved, the thing that the lover is concerned to prevent at all possible cost, is deeply felt, but it's deeply felt not just because it's a loss to the individual, that's part of the illusion of this sort of desire and love, but because it affects the life of the species, which is reaching out through him, which is provoking his desires as its instrument. And he says, this is an interesting observation, this is why heroes, right, virtuous men, great men, are, in literature especially, not ashamed of expressing weakness in the grip of love. Why? Because it's this. Why? Because it's the species and not the individual that is lamenting. So, a strong man overwhelmed by love, grieving the loss of love, or desiring great love. It's not. He's saying not a sign of individual weakness to be subject to these things. What we get in the remainder of this section is a sort of a catalog, a walkthrough of the different things which are ultimately overwhelmed by sexual love. Right? Sexual love overwhelms honor. Right? There are people who will, men of great honor, who will sacrifice their honor in the interest of this kind of passion. It trumps individual interest. It trumps virtue, he even says. It will overwhelm virtue. Otherwise, virtuous people will act from passion. For what reason? Because there's a higher power, he says, a higher right that's ultimately in control of them. They're obeying a sort of a deeper, might say something from deeper in the source code of their humanity, of their existence. Sexual passion trumps differences of rank and circumstance. We see this in literature all the time. Right? What happens is the species merely sets these aside in pursuit of its goals. These mean nothing to it. Right? This is the reason we have the image of Cupid, who bewitches people, who shoots them with his arrows, and causes them to fall in love with absolutely the most inappropriate person. And then Schopenhauer says, in literature, this is the reason why in literature and in drama, we sympathize with the young lovers, not merely because we want the young lovers to triumph over the conventional cultural desires or the sort of conservatism of their parents, but because in the lovers we see the species in them, through them, striving towards a higher goal, the production of their unique offspring, a goal that is much higher than whatever sort of conventional pieties or circumstances, the production, the preservation of the property or some kind of material advantage that their parents and other authority figures want for them, respectability and the like. Why do we sympathize? Not because we think that individual satisfaction is better than respectability and utility and preservation of property, but because we see that the species, the sort of the thing in itself, will, is active in the lovers, and more so than in the conventional forces trying to keep them apart. Schopenhauer says comedies will please us, the audience, the ones viewing them. They entertain and please us because we like to see youth triumph. Now, the youth seem to be happy, right? They seem to have gotten exactly what they want. But what's really happening is that they're satisfying the species' drive, nature's drive, that is expressed through them. And he has this interesting sort of speculation, I'll say, that if the lovers, in an inferior comedy, if the lovers were to attain happiness at the cost of the interest of the species, that is, if they can sort of go off and be together, but I suppose we'd say in a sterile way or in a way that doesn't actually achieve this kind of union that pushes the human race forward, we in the audience are disturbed and displeased by this spectacle. This is not entertaining. This is not the kind of satisfaction that we expect. Why? Because winning, putting your selfish advantage over the realization of what the species is trying to do through you is simply doesn't satisfy us. We don't applaud that. So we find that a mark of an inferior comedy. We can't enjoy it in that way. In the next section of this chapter, Schopenhauer is going to talk about the way that in love, all of us, are ruled by will. We'll talk about that in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.
The Metaphysics of Sexual Love, Part 7.
Here let me remark in passing that however much my metaphysics of love will displease the very persons who are entangled in this passion, yet if rational considerations in general could avail anything against it, the fundamental truth disclosed by me would necessarily fit one more than anything else to subdue it.
In this section, Schopenhauer discusses three themes in connection with the role of will in human love affairs: tragedy, hate, and different types of marriages. Here's the text. The love of a man often affords comical, and sometimes also tragical, phenomena, both because, taken possession of by the spirit of the species, he is now ruled by this, and no longer belongs to himself. His conduct thereby becomes unsuited to the individual. That which, in the higher grades of love, imparts such a tinge of poetry and sublimeness to his thoughts, which gives them even a transcendental and hyperphysical tendency, on account of which he seems to lose sight altogether of his real, very physical aim, is at bottom this: that he is now inspired by the spirit of the species, whose affairs are infinitely more important than all those which concern mere individuals, in order to find, under the special directions of this spirit, the whole existence of an indefinitely long posterity with this individual and exactly determined nature, which it can receive only from him as father and the woman he loves as mother, and which otherwise could never as such attain to existence, while the objectification of the will to live expressly demands this existence. It is the feeling that he is acting in affairs of such transcendent importance which raises the lover so high above everything earthly, nay, even above himself, and gives such a hyperphysical clothing to his very physical desires, that love becomes a poetical episode even in the life of the most prosaic man, in which last case the matter sometimes assumes a comical aspect. That mandate of the will, which objectifies itself in the species, exhibits itself in the consciousness of the lover under the mask of the anticipation of an infinite blessedness which is to be found for him in the union with this female individual. Now, in the highest grades of love, this chimera becomes so radiant that if it cannot be attained, life itself loses all charm, and now appears so joyless, hollow, and insupportable that the disgust at it even overcomes the fear of death, so that it is then sometimes voluntarily cut short. The will of such a man has been caught in the vortex of the will of the species, or this has obtained such a great predominance over the individual will that if such a man cannot be effective in the first capacity, he disdains to be so in the last. The individual is here too weak a vessel to be capable of enduring the infinite longing of the will of the species concentrated upon a definite object. In this case, therefore, the issue is suicide, sometimes the double suicide of the two lovers, unless, to save life, nature allows madness to intervene, which then covers with its veil the consciousness of that hopeless state. No year passes without proving the reality of what has been expounded by several cases of all these kinds. Not only, however, has the unsatisfied passion of love sometimes a tragic issue, but the satisfied passion also leads oftener to unhappiness than to happiness, for its demands often conflict so much with the personal welfare of him who is concerned that they undermine it, because they are incompatible with his other circumstances, and disturb the plan of life built upon them. Nay, not only with external circumstances is love often in contradiction, but even with the lover's own individuality, for it flings itself upon persons who, apart from the sexual relation, would be hateful, contemptible, and even abhorrent to the lover. But so much more powerful is the will of the species than that of the individual, that the lover shuts his eyes to all those qualities which are repellent to him, overlooks all, ignores all, and binds himself forever to the object of his passion. So entirely is he blinded by that illusion, which vanishes as soon as the will of the species is satisfied, and leaves behind a detested companion for life. Only from this can it be explained that we often see very reasonable and excellent men bound to termagants and she-devils, and cannot conceive how they could have made such a choice. On this account, the ancients presented love as blind. Indeed, a lover may even know distinctly and feel bitterly the faults of temperament and character of his bride, which promise him a miserable life, and yet not be frightened away. I ask not, I care not, if guilt's in thy heart, I know that I love thee, whatever thou art. For ultimately he seeks not his own things, but those of a third person, who has yet to come into being, although he is involved in the illusion that what he seeks is his own affair. But it is just this not seeking of one's own things, which is everywhere the stamp of greatness, that gives to passionate love also a touch of sublimity, and makes it a worthy subject of poetry. Finally, sexual love is compatible even with the extremest hatred towards its object. Therefore Plato has compared it to the love of the wolf for the sheep. This case appears when a passionate lover, in spite of all efforts and entreaties, cannot obtain a favorable hearing on any condition. I love and hate her. The hatred of the loved one, which then is kindled, sometimes goes so far that the lover murders her, and then himself. One or two examples of this generally happen every year. They will be found in the newspapers. Therefore, Goethe's lines are quite correct. By all despised love, by hellish element, would that I knew a worse that I might swear by. It is really no hyperbole if a lover describes the coldness of his beloved and the delight of her vanity, which feeds on his sufferings, as cruelty, for he is under the influence of an impulse which, akin to the instinct of insects, compels him, in spite of all grounds of reason, to pursue his end unconditionally and to undervalue everything else. He cannot give it up. Not one but many a Petrarch has there been who was compelled to drag through life the unsatisfied ardor of love, like a fetter, an iron weight at his foot, and breathe his sighs in lonely woods. But only in the one Petrarch dwelt also the gift of poetry, so that Goethe's beautiful lines hold good of him. And when in misery the man was dumb, a god gave me the power to tell my sorrow. In fact, the genius of the species wages war throughout with the guardian geniuses of individuals, is their pursuer and enemy, always ready relentlessly to destroy personal happiness in order to carry out its ends. Nay, the welfare of whole nations has sometimes been sacrificed to its humors. An example of this is given us by Shakespeare in Henry VI, Part 3, Act 3, Scenes 2 and 3. All this depends upon the fact that the species, as that in which the root of our being lies, has a closer and earlier right to us than the individual. Hence, its affairs take precedence. From the feeling of this, the ancients personified the genius of the species in Cupid, a malevolent, cruel, and therefore ill-reputed god, in spite of his childish appearance, a capricious, despotic demon, but yet lord of gods and men. Tu deorum hominumque tyranne amor. You, Eros, tyrannically rule over gods and men. A deadly shot, blindness, and wings are his attributes. The latter signify inconstancy, and this appears, as a rule, only with the disillusion which is the consequence of satisfaction. Because the passion depended upon an illusion which represented that which has only value for the species as valuable for the individual, the deception must vanish after the attainment of the end of the species. The spirit of the species which took possession of the individual sets it free again. Forsaken by this spirit, the individual falls back into its original limitation and narrowness, and sees with wonder that after such a high, heroic, and infinite effort, nothing has resulted for its pleasure but what every sexual gratification affords. Contrary to expectation, it finds itself no happier than before. It observes that it has been the dupe of the will of the species. Therefore, as a rule, a Theseus who has been made happy will forsake his Ariadne. If Petrarch's passion had been satisfied, his song would have been silenced from that time forth, like that of the bird, as soon as the eggs are laid. Here let me remark in passing that however much my metaphysics of love will displease the very persons who are entangled in this passion, Yet, if rational considerations in general could avail anything against it, the fundamental truth disclosed by me would necessarily fit one more than anything else to subdue it. But the saying of the old comedian will no doubt remain true. Quae res in se neque consilium, neque modum habet ullum, eam consilio regere non potes. What has neither reason nor moderation in itself cannot be governed by reason. Marriages from love are made in the interest of the species, not of the individuals. Certainly the persons concerned imagine that they are advancing their own happiness, but their real end is one which is foreign to themselves, for it lies in the production of an individual which is only possible through them. Brought together by this aim, they ought henceforth to try to get on together as well as possible. But very often the pair brought together by that instinctive illusion, which is the essence of passionate love, will, in other respects, be of very different natures. This comes to light when the illusion vanishes, as it necessarily must. Accordingly, love marriages, as a rule, turn out unhappy, for through them the coming generation is cared for at the expense of the present. Quien se casa por amores, ha de vivir con dolores. Who marries for love must live in sorrow, says the Spanish proverb. The opposite is the case with marriages contracted for purposes of convenience, generally in accordance with the choice of the parents. The considerations prevailing here, of whatever kind they may be, are at least real, and cannot vanish of themselves. Through them, however, the happiness of the present generation is certainly cared for to the disadvantage of the coming generation, and notwithstanding this, it remains problematical. The man who in his marriage looks to money more than to the satisfaction of his inclination lives more in the individual than in the species, which is directly opposed to the truth. Hence it appears unnatural and excites a certain contempt. A girl who, against the advice of her parents, rejects the offer of a rich and not yet old man, in order, setting aside all considerations of convenience, to choose according to her instinctive inclination alone, sacrifices her individual welfare to the species. But just on this account, one cannot withhold from her a certain approbation, for she has preferred what is of most importance, and has acted in the spirit of nature, more exactly, of the species, while the parents advised in the spirit of individual egoism. In accordance with all this, it appears as if, in making a marriage, either the individual or the interests of the species must come off a loser. And this is generally the case, for that convenience and passionate love should go hand in hand is the rarest of lucky accidents. The physical, moral, or intellectual deficiency of the nature of most men may to some extent have its ground in the fact that marriages are ordinarily entered into not from pure choice and inclination, but from all kinds of external considerations, and on account of accidental circumstances. If, however, besides convenience, inclination is also to a certain extent regarded, this is, as it were, an agreement with the genius of the species. Happy marriages are well known to be rare, just because it lies in the nature of marriage that its chief end is not the present, but the coming generation. However, let me add, for the consolation of tender, loving natures, that sometimes passionate sexual love associates itself with a feeling of an entirely different origin, real friendship based upon agreement of disposition, which yet, for the most part, only appears when sexual love proper is extinguished in its satisfaction. This friendship will then generally spring from the fact that the supplementing and corresponding physical, moral, and intellectual qualities of the two individuals, from which sexual love arose, with reference to the child to be produced, are, with reference also to the individuals themselves, related to each other in a supplementary manner as opposite qualities of temperament and mental gifts, and thereby form the basis of a harmony of disposition. Our love affairs are by turns comic and tragic, because when we are in love, we obey the demands of our species being, and are incapable of weighing our own self-interest. Of course, this also makes love affairs a great topic for poetry and drama.
In his focus on the beloved and implicitly on their descendants, the lover strives towards the infinite. This is what colors sexual desire with transcendent importance and the illusion of eternal happiness. At the extreme, when one is caught in the vortex of the will of the species, even life itself seems absurd and offensive compared to possessing the loved one. In such a lover, the individual will has been completely dominated by the species will. His alternatives to having the beloved are madness or death. And there are many such cases, says Schopenhauer, in current newspapers, in history, and in literature. And even satisfied love can still be tragic, as will provokes irresistible attractions between people who may afterwards ruin each other's lives. Love blinds the judgment of the lover until nature achieves its purpose through him. The selflessness of love is what inspires poets, how a man can, will, and sometimes must throw away everything valuable to him, up to and including his life, at love's command. Sexual love is compatible with extreme hatred, says Schopenhauer. He compares the lover's compulsion to the relentless, unthinking advance of insects towards their goal, suggesting it comes from a very primitive level of our physiology. He mentions Petrarch as an example. The poet Petrarch carried a passionate, unrequited love for a woman named Laura, from when he first saw her in 1327 until her death more than 20 years later. His frustrated love, followed by intense grief, were the subject of and the driving force behind many of his poems. Now, there is an ongoing war of the species against its individuals, says Schopenhauer, where despite his temporary illusions, the individual always loses. The species' interests are longer term, they are more deeply rooted in us, and so they take precedence in any conflict with our personal interests. Schopenhauer is fairly cynical here about the ultimate value of the satisfaction of desire. Once nature achieves its goal, the result is a fall from the heights, an almost bewildered disappointment, and, despite the grand promises of love, the individual is no happier than before. This theory will anger lovers, he says, but if they could think clearly, they would realize that adopting his views is the best way to defend themselves against the toil and agony of love. But if they are in the grip of passion, they are unlikely to take this advice, he says. His third topic here is marriage. Marriages for love come not from the feeling and choice of the lovers, but from will, from the interest of the human race. And because of this, love marriages can collapse into unhappiness once their real basis, which is the production of children, is achieved. The mutual affection of the lovers was an illusion that nature used to trick them into reproducing. Ironically, marriages made for financial or social reasons may turn out happier, since money and status are real things that last, unlike the mutual enjoyment of lovers. We might think here of Schopenhauer's contemporary Jane Austen, who died in 1817, the year he first published World as Will. In Pride and Prejudice, the heroine's friend, Charlotte, marries Mr. Collins in order to get financial security. This is an important contrast to the protagonist's hope for a marriage to a man she can love. Schopenhauer observes that to place advantage over love seems contemptible to us for this reason. The one doing so seeks gain for himself at the present time in money or status, at the expense of producing these specific offspring called for by will in future generations. In a sense, he neglects his duty to the future of the human race in order to live more comfortably in the present. He's stealing from our collective future. For similar reasons, a girl who marries for love and then suffers for it attracts our sympathy. She's done her duty and served the demands of will at her own personal expense. Schopenhauer ends with a suggestion, hopeful but also smirking, that in a marriage that combines passionate sexual love, similarity of disposition, and genuine friendship, it may be possible to live out a lifetime happy together, perfectly matched. This, of course, was not the case with Schopenhauer, who was a bachelor his whole life long. That brings us to the end of this section. Next, Schopenhauer will summarize his views and bring the chapter to a close. We'll read that in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. The Metaphysics of Sexual Love, Part 8. Through this, then, man shows that the species lies closer to him than the individual,
and he lives more immediately in the former than in the latter. Why does the lover hang with complete abandonment on the eyes of his chosen one, and is ready to make every sacrifice for her? Because it is his immortal part that longs after her, while it is only his mortal part that desires everything else. The whole metaphysics of love here dealt with stands in close connection with my metaphysics in general, and the light which it throws upon this may be summed up as follows. We have seen that the careful selection for the satisfaction of the sexual impulse, a selection which rises through innumerable degrees up to that of passionate love, depends upon the highly serious interest which man takes in the special personal constitution of the next generation. Now, this exceedingly remarkable interest confirms two truths which have been set forth in the preceding chapters. 1. The indestructibility of the true nature of man, which lives on in that coming generation. For that interest which is so lively and eager, and does not spring from reflection and intention, but from the inmost characteristics and tendencies of our nature, could not be so indelibly present and exercise such great power over man if he were absolutely perishable, and were merely followed in time by a race actually and entirely different from him. 2. That his true nature lies more in the species than in the individual. For that interest in the special nature of the species, which is the root of all love, from the passing inclination to the serious passion, is for everyone really the highest concern, the success or failure of which touches him most sensibly. Therefore, it is called par excellence the affair of the heart. Moreover, when this interest has expressed itself strongly and decidedly, everything which merely concerns one's own person is postponed and necessarily sacrificed to it. Through this, then, man shows that the species lies closer to him than the individual, and he lives more immediately in the former than in the latter. Why does the lover hang with complete abandonment on the eyes of his chosen one, and is ready to make every sacrifice for her? Because it is his immortal part that longs after her, while it is only his mortal part that desires everything else. That vehement or intense longing directed to a particular woman is accordingly an immediate pledge of the indestructibility of the kernel of our being, and of its continued existence in the species. But to regard this continued existence as something trifling and insufficient is an error which arises from the fact that under the conception of the continued life of the species, one thinks nothing more than the future existence of beings similar to us, but in no regard identical with us. And this again because, starting from knowledge directed towards without, one takes into consideration only the external form of the species as we apprehend it in perception, and not its inner nature. But it is just this inner nature which lies at the foundation of our own consciousness as its kernel, and hence indeed is more immediate than this itself, and, as thing in itself, free from the principium individuationis, is really the same and identical in all individuals, whether they exist together or after each other. Now this is the will to live, thus just that which desires life and continuance so vehemently. This accordingly is spared and unaffected by death. It can attain to no better state than its present one, and consequently for it, with life, the constant suffering and striving of the individuals is certain. To free it from this is reserved for the denial of the will to live, as the means by which the individual will breaks away from the stem of the species and surrenders that existence in it. We lack conceptions for that which it now is. Indeed, all data for the conceptions are wanting. We can only describe it as that which is free to be will to live or not. Buddhism denotes the latter case by the word nirvana, the etymology of which was given in the note at the end of chapter 41. It is the point which remains forever unattainable to all human knowledge, just as such. If now, from the standpoint of this last consideration, we contemplate the turmoil of life, we behold all occupied with its want and misery, straining all of their powers to satisfy its infinite needs and to ward off its multifarious sorrows, yet without daring to hope anything else than simply the preservation of this tormented existence for a short span of time. In between, however, in the midst of the tumult, we see the glances of two lovers meet longingly. Yet why so secretly, fearfully, and stealthily? Because these lovers are the traitors who seek to perpetuate the whole wanton drudgery, which would otherwise speedily reach an end. This they wish to frustrate, as others like them have frustrated it before. This consideration already passes over into the subject of the following chapter. Translator's note. The appendix to this chapter was added only in the third edition of the German, and is meant to explain, in consistency with Schopenhauer's general principles, the wide prevalence of the practice of pederasty among different nations and in different ages. It is omitted. Schopenhauer concludes this chapter with about 2.5 pages of a discussion connecting what he said about sexual love to his metaphysics in general. And this is the metaphysics of will. Will, this fundamental blind striving, which is ultimately futile, but which is the fundamental reality, the life force that unites all things. This is the Kantian thing in itself. This is what's really going on behind all the appearances. So what do we learn about will from our reflections and on analysis of the experience, the sort of empirical reality of sexual desire in humans? Well, we find, says Schopenhauer, that sexual desire is deeply rooted in us, and it seems to be entirely out of proportion to the benefit it brings to any particular individual who is subject to it. The pleasure to be had, he said repeatedly, is one of those things that's an object of kind of disappointed reflection in every case, and yet we are driven onward by it, and irresistibly so. And this is a good indication that what is really at work here is something that goes far deeper than individual interest. So we saw Schopenhauer's reflections in previous parts of the chapter about how every individual thinks that he is making a choice according to his own desire to fulfill himself, and yet in every case it is will, it is species, it is nature that is directing him, wearing him like a glove, as it were, sort of directing his actions, while he, in his own sort of subjective phenomenal experience, imagines that he is free and that he is ardently seeking his own happiness. But what's really happening is that will is serving itself through the prospect of producing children of a particular character, of a particular nature, that can only be produced by the union of this man and this woman. So this is Schopenhauer's idea that this kind of the will is kind of reaching forward through the lovers, attracting them to each other. This is, I've mentioned previously, pre-Darwin, but obviously part of the same kind of movement. What are the biological imperatives that are expressed in these different cultural and individual acts of choosing and will and desire and happiness, and even then despair and suicide when desire is frustrated and people cannot be together? So to take a look just at some of what he's had to say here, what do we see? What do we sum up? Well, he says this, one, that the careful selection for the satisfaction of sexual impulse, the fact that we take great care in discerning which person it is with whom we want to reproduce, depends upon the highly serious interest which man in general takes in the constitution of the next generation. It matters a great deal to us what the next generation will be like, although that's not what we're thinking of when I'm thinking of my attraction to this particular woman, or she's thinking of her attraction to me or to some other man. And this remarkable interest confirms two truths set forward already earlier in World as Will. First, the indestructibility of the true nature of man. What's the true nature of man? It's what we might call our species being. It's not me that is indestructible, that will have a sort of immortal life after death in heaven with God or in any other form. It's us. We, collectively as the human race, are indestructible. We will always be sort of reaching on as will from generation to generation. As our parents passed it down to us, we pass it down to and through our children.
And that's the fundamental reality of human life. Not me and you, but us collectively as a species. We might say the through line for the story of humanity is will reaching through, sort of like maybe like electricity transmitted along a wire, right? Or maybe a bucket brigade, right, being passed from bit to bit, will sort of working itself out through history, through the constant desire to, and the uninterrupted chain of reproduction, producing new human subjects to carry on and to do the exact same thing in the future. And this shows, he thinks, this is the indestructibility of the human race. The interest that we take, the fact that we have this kind of drive to create the next generation, and that it be of such and such a character, though that reasoning is done at the level of nature, it's not anything that any of us deliberates over, would not be nearly so intense and inexorably present if men were absolutely perishable, or if we'd be followed in time by some alien beings which would have no genetic relation to us, wouldn't be similar to us in any regard at all. Well, in that case, we wouldn't feel this kind of will reaching through us into the future, which constitutes, he thinks, the sort of motive power of sexual desire. And second, this is where it really, the metaphysical conclusion is important. This shows that the human nature is more species than will. More species than individual. The true nature of each of us as humanity lies more in our species being, which is expressed through this carrying on in time of sexual reproduction, more so than in any particular achievement that I would grasp towards or struggle to achieve myself. He speaks in a way here, which he does elsewhere, that in a sense it's the immortal part of the lover that desires the beloved. So what's really going on here? The part of me that is capable of going, sort of reaching on and thinking about the closest thing to eternity here, the perpetuity of the human race. That's the part that is really kind of activated in and desires this particular woman at this particular time. It's the sexual desire is where I serve most directly and most clearly the interests of all of us, of species, of the human species, which is, to return to this again, that is the thing in itself. That's the true reality of the human race and of human nature. So I am, we might say, most fully human. I am advancing the human race most completely and most directly in just that kind of moment and just that kind of activity. Everything else I do is going to be subordinate to that. He's actually going to say that's why it is that a man is willing to give up fame and fortune and high office and even respectability in the interest of this. Why? Because this is really where the true humanity of each person comes kind of closest to the surface in terms of their acting in this world. And so, and this inner nature, what is this? What is this sort of striving towards this perpetuity of the human race, this striving forward? That's will. It's the will to live. You know, the will to live present in each of us, freed from this principle of individuation. Okay? It is the same in every individual. So my striving towards my genetic future, right? So the future progeny that will survive me, it's the same as everybody else's. It's identical in every human being. It's not individuated the way that each of us is. So the true reality, the sort of the deeper reality of human nature is that it's not me and my achievements and what I do. So this is kind of concluding his analysis of sexual desire. Why is it so pervasive? Why is it so powerful? Why is it so universal? Why is it the way that it is? Because it is deeply connected to this root idea of human nature, this root reality of human nature as the struggling of the will to live through time, through our descendants. It's using us in just this way. So you might think about here, reflect on what would it mean to take this seriously and to be really deeply affected by this, to say, yes, this is what I am for all of my own individual projects, my own sort of striving and desire for happiness in this life, my hope to have certain kinds of experiences and to avoid certain other kinds of experiences for the remainder of my time alive. All of that is kind of secondary to this drive to carry forward the human race, where the will to live is most powerful. And then he makes a reference to this nirvana escape hatch that we might talk about later, to free it from, human nature the will to live can attain no better state than its present one, right? This is the best that it's got, right? Is I got these humans, reproducing and carrying on, and so I'm sort of riding the wave forward into the future. The will to live is, we might say, successful in this case. And consequently, for the will to live with life, the constant suffering and striving of the individual is certain. Well, yeah, that's why we suffer. That's why we strive, etc. To free it from this is reserved for the denial of the will to live. So here's the escape hatch. Here's the possibility. What if we could turn will back on itself? What if we could find a way in ourselves to sort of escape from this constant desire for the futile suffering? Excuse me. We lack concepts for that which it now is. All data for such conceptions are wanting. We're talking about something outside of the phenomenal world, at the level of the thing itself. We can only describe it as that which is free to be will to live or not. It's scarcely imaginable for me in my current form, because I very much want to continue living, both kind of consciously and unconsciously, right? If there's an immediate threat to my life, I struggle against it just instinctively. So everything about me is kind of thrusting forward, leaning forward into the future, into preserving the will to live. My very existence is the kind of unfolding of my continued will to live. What would it be like to be the kind of being, or the kind of will which is free to be the will to live or not to be the will to live? Where would that kind of freedom, where would that kind of power come from? This would be a very high level of philosophical enlightenment. He mentions nirvana in this point. It's kind of the Buddhist achievement. This is to be achieved through perhaps what Nietzsche will later call the ascetic ideal. Okay, we don't have room for that in this chapter, and Schopenhauer only gestures at it. He mentions that it is the subject of the next chapter, which is titled On the Assertion of the Will to Live. I don't know when we'll get to that, but perhaps we can take a look at that in another series of videos on this channel. And he concludes with something I think I shared a previous Valentine's Day. This analysis of two young lovers. What in the midst of all of this tormented existence, the glances of two lovers meet longingly, right? The sort of the storm of the world, and then there's two, their eyes meet, and they're in love, and they see each other, and they're making plans, right? Why so secretly? Why so fearfully? Why so stealthily? Why do they seek out, to be alone? Well, Schopenhauer's answer, in part, because they are traitors to suffering humanity. Humanity would fizzle out quickly if these people didn't go keep doing what they're doing and creating more humans, which carry on, serve the interest of will by carrying on this cycle of suffering. So they wish to frustrate it, as others before them have frustrated it. Our parents did as well. And so it's an interesting idea, perhaps somewhat ironical, or perhaps not ironical at all, about the lovers meeting as the kind of secret traitors to all of us who would prefer to be free, as if the human race sort of crash land and no longer carry forward into the future. This translation also ends with, this is an early 20th century translation. This ends with the translator's note that the appendix on pederasty added in the final edition of World as Will is omitted here. Well, I won't have that at all. So we are going to include the appendix with Schopenhauer's extensive thoughts about the institution of pederasty in the ancient world and the reasons for it and how it fits in with his entire theory of sexual love and the metaphysics behind it. We're going to look at that in the next video, number 9, which will be the final one in this series about the chapter on the metaphysics of sexual love. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please leave me a comment below, make some suggestions about what I might do next. Share this series with anyone you think might be interested in it. And thanks for watching today. Goodbye. The Metaphysics of Sexual Love, Part 9, the Appendix on Pederasty. Moreover, in the East, shortages of women resulting from polygamy may at times give rise to forced exceptions to this rule. This can also happen in colonies still new and therefore without women, such as California and others. Schopenhauer published 3 editions of The World as Will and Representation in his lifetime. The third edition came out in 1859, the year before he died, and it was in this edition that he added this appendix to chapter 44 on the metaphysics of sexual love, the metaphysics of love between the sexes. This was the appendix which, as I observed at the end of the previous video, his first English translators, Haldane and Kemp from 1883, declined to translate into English, with a kind of what I thought was kind of a feeble excuse, perhaps because it would outrage the sensibilities of Victorian Englishmen. So I have taken this text from the 1958 English translation by E.F.J. Payne. That's not the most recent translation, but it is the one that I'm going to use here. So we can hear what Schopenhauer has to say. This is a long passage, quite a long bit of text. Schopenhauer here is going to, I think, proceed in three parts. We're going to see him first set up the problem by making some observations about pederasty. He's going to explain it as a kind of misguided instinct, a kind of natural thing. So the setup is going to go roughly like this. Doesn't the existence of pederasty, and we might say as well similar behaviors, present an objection to Schopenhauer's theory that sexuality is about instinct, is instinct driven towards the production of excellent offspring in the next generation? Doesn't this present evidence contrary, phenomena contrary to his theory that his theory can't account for? So this appendix it will then go through in the main part his attempt to give an explanation of how his theory can be adapted, or not even adapted. His theory explains this as an element of instinct. So he's going to explain this kind of behavior as proceeding from a certain kind of nature and a certain kind of instinct. I suppose here I should have done before, define pederasty as it's being used here. This refers to sexual relationships between adult men and adolescent boys. It is an all-male phenomenon. In the classical understanding, the kind you hear referred to in ancient Greece, it would typically involve an older man and always an adolescent, as far as I know. I don't think there's been any suggestion that the ancient world included sexual contact between adult men and pre-pubescent children, what we would call unambiguously child molesting. What is described here probably does fall under a number of legal prohibitions at our own place and time, as well as moral judgments. I want to note here that although Schopenhauer uses some very charged language here, he doesn't. He ends up not really applying moral categories. He wants to explain this phenomenon in terms of instincts and metaphysics, which is not going to be judgmental. Right? Instinct, we might say, to adapt a phrase common in our own time, merely is what it is. So, in some important ways here, Schopenhauer is prefiguring Darwin and sociobiology in other attempts to explain sexual behaviors that don't seem directly useful for the reproduction and perpetuation of the human race. As a bonus at the end of this video, I'm going to include and share with you some passages from two recent scholars writing about Schopenhauer and about this specific appendix on pederasty. I'm going to share their ideas. That's Brian McGee and David Bather Woods, a recent biographer of Schopenhauer. So stick around to the end of the video for that. With that said, here's the text. Appendix to the previous chapter. Are you so shameless that you dare to express such a word and think you will escape punishment? I have escaped, for truth is my witness. Sophocles, Oedipus Rex. On a previous page, I casually mentioned pederasty, describing it as a misguided instinct. This seemed to me sufficient when I was working on the second edition. Further reflection on this aberration has since enabled me to discover a remarkable problem, and its solution also. This presupposes the preceding chapter, but also throws light on it, and therefore helps to supplement and support the fundamental view there expounded. Considered in itself, pederasty appears to be a monstrosity, not merely contrary to nature, but in the highest degree repulsive and abominable. It seems an act to which only a thoroughly perverse, distorted, and degenerate nature could at any time descend, and which would be repeated in quite isolated cases at most. But if we turn to experience, we find the opposite. We see this vice fully in vogue,
and frequently practiced at all times and in all countries of the world, in spite of its detestable nature. We all know that it was generally widespread among the Greeks and Romans, and was publicly admitted and practiced unabashed. All the authors of antiquity give more than abundant proof of this. In particular, the poets, one and all, are full of this topic. Not even the respectable Virgil is an exception. It is ascribed even to the poets of remote antiquity, to Orpheus, who was torn to pieces for it by the Maenads, to Thamyris, and even to the gods themselves. The philosophers also speak much more of this love than of the love of women. In particular, Plato seems to know of hardly any other, and likewise the Stoics, who mention it as worthy of the sage. In the Symposium, Plato even mentions, to the credit of Socrates, as an unexampled act of heroism, that he scorned Alcibiades, who offered himself to him for the purpose. In Xenophon's Memorabilia, Socrates speaks of pederasty as a thing blameless and even praiseworthy. Likewise, in the Memorabilia, where Socrates warns of the dangers of love, he speaks so exclusively of love of boys that one would imagine there were no women at all. Even Aristotle speaks of pederasty as of a usual thing, without censuring it. He mentions that it was held in public esteem by the Celts, that the Cretans and their laws countenanced it as a means against overpopulation, and he recounts the male love affair, Männerliebschaft, of Philolaus the legislator, and so on. Even Cicero says, Apud Grecos opprobrio fuit adolescentibus si amatores non haberent. Among the Greeks it was regarded as disgraceful for youths not to have lovers. Here in general there is no need of proofs for well-informed readers. They can recall them by the hundred, for with the ancients everything is full of it. But even among the less cultured peoples, particularly the Gauls, the vice was very much in vogue. If we turn to Asia, we see all the countries of that continent permeated with the vice from the earliest times down to the present day, and likewise with no special attempt to conceal it. Hindus and Chinese, no less than the peoples of Islam, whose poets also we find much more concerned with love of boys than with love of women. For example, in Sadi's Gulistan, the book On Love speaks exclusively of the former. Even to the Hebrews, this vice was not unknown, for the Old and New Testaments mention it as punishable. Finally, in Christian Europe, religion, legislation, and public opinion have had to oppose it with all their force. In the Middle Ages, it was everywhere a capital offense. In France, it was punishable even in the 16th century by burning at the stake. And in England, even up to about 1830, the death penalty for it was rigorously carried out. The punishment now is deportation for life. Such strong measures, therefore, were needed to put a stop to the vice. Indeed, they were remarkably successful, yet they did not by any means succeed in exterminating it. On the contrary, it slinks around at all times and in all places, in all countries and among all classes, under the veil of the deepest secrecy, and it often comes to light where least expected. Even in earlier centuries it was no different, in spite of all the death penalties. The mentions of and allusions to it in the works of all those times are evidence of this. If we realize all this, and think it over carefully, we see pederasty appearing at all times and in all countries in a way very far removed from that which we had at first presupposed, when we considered it merely in itself, and hence a priori. Thus the universal nature and persistent ineradicability of the thing show that it arises in some way from human nature itself, since for this reason alone could it inevitably appear always and everywhere, as a proof of the saying, Naturam expellis furca, tamen usque recurret. Expel nature with the pitchfork, still she returns. Therefore, we cannot possibly escape this conclusion if we intend to proceed openly and honestly. To overlook these facts, and to rest content with reviling and rebuking the vice, would of course be easy. This, however, is not my way of settling problems, but, faithful even here to my innate disposition to investigate truth everywhere, and to get to the bottom of things, I first of all acknowledge the phenomenon that presents itself for explanation, together with the inevitable conclusion to be drawn from it. Now that something so thoroughly contrary to nature,
indeed going against nature in the matter of the greatest importance and concern to her, should arise from nature herself, is such an unheard-of paradox that its explanation confronts us as a difficult problem. However, I shall now solve it by discovering the secret of nature which lies at its root. As a starting point, let me make use of a passage in Aristotle's Politics. Here he first of all explains that people who are too young produce inferior, feeble, defective, and undersized children, and further, that the same thing applies to the offspring of those who are too old. Because children of parents who are too old, like those of parents who are too young, will turn out to be incomplete in body and mind, and children of the elderly are weaklings. Now, what Aristotle states as the rule for the individual is laid down by Stobaeus as a law for the community at the end of his exposition of the peripatetic philosophy. To achieve strength and perfection of the body, people should not marry when they are too young or too old, because at both times of life they will conceive only imperfect children, and consequently only weaklings will be born. Aristotle, therefore, lays down that a man who is 54 years of age should not have any more children, though he may still continue cohabitation for the sake of his health, or for any other reason. He does not say how this is to be carried into effect, but he is obviously of the opinion that children conceived when their parents are of such an age should be disposed of by abortion, for he had recommended this a few lines previously. Now, nature on her part cannot dispute the fact that forms the basis of Aristotle's precept, nor can she eliminate it. For, in consequence of her principle that natura non facit saltus, she could not suddenly stop a man's secretion of semen, but here, as in every case of mortification and decay, a gradual deterioration had to precede it. But procreation during this deterioration would bring into the world human beings who would be weak, dull, sickly, wretched, and short-lived. In fact, only too often this does happen. Children conceived by elderly parents frequently die off at an early age. In any case, they never reach a great age. They are more or less frail, sickly, feeble, and their offspring are similarly constituted. What is said here about procreation during the years of decline applies just as much to procreation at an immature age. But there is nothing so dear to the heart of nature as the maintenance and preservation of the species and of its genuine type. The means to this end are strong and vigorous individuals of sound constitution. Nature desires these alone. In fact, at bottom she regards and treats individuals only as means, and the species alone as the end, as was shown in chapter 41. Accordingly, in consequence of nature's own laws and aims, we here see her in a critical situation and actually in great straits. As a result of her essential condition, she could not possibly count on a high-handed expedient, depending on the arbitrary will of some person, such as that suggested by Aristotle, and just as little could she rely on men's being taught by experience to recognize the disadvantages of too early or too late procreation, and accordingly curbing their desires as a result of cold and rational deliberation. Therefore, in so important a matter, nature could not risk either of these expedients. There was then nothing left for her but to choose the lesser of two evils. But for this purpose she had to make use here, in her own interests, of her favorite instrument, instinct. As was shown in the preceding chapter, this everywhere guides and directs so important a business as procreation, and creates such strange illusions. But this could happen here only by her misdirecting the instinct, lui donnant le change. Thus, nature knows only the physical, not the moral. In fact, there is even a decided antagonism between her and morality. Her sole aim is preservation of the individual, and especially of the species, in the greatest possible perfection. Now, it is true that pederasty is detrimental to those youths who have been seduced into practicing it, yet not so much so that it would not be the lesser of two evils. Nature accordingly chooses this in order to avoid by a wide margin the far greater evil, deprivation of the species, and so to avert a lasting and growing misfortune. As a result of this prudence on nature's part, a tendency to pederasty gradually and almost imperceptibly appears at about the age stated by Aristotle. This tendency becomes more and more definite and decided in proportion as the ability to beget strong and healthy children grows less and less. This is how nature arranges things. It should be noted, however, that it is still a very long way from the first appearance of this tendency to the vice itself. It is true that if, as in ancient Greece and Rome, or in Asia at all times, this tendency is not checked, it can easily lead to the vice through encouragement by example. The result then is that it becomes very widespread. In Europe, on the other hand, it is opposed by such powerful motives of religion, morality, law, and honor that almost everyone shrinks at the mere thought of it, and we may assume accordingly that out of some 300 who feel the tendency, hardly more than one will be so feeble and crazy as to give way to it. This is all the more certain as this tendency appears only at that age when the blood has cooled down and the sexual impulse in general has declined. On the other hand, the tendency finds such strong opponents in mature reason, in the caution and discretion gained through experience, and in steadiness and firmness exercised in many different ways, that only a thoroughly depraved nature will succumb to it. Meanwhile, nature's object here is attained by the fact that this tendency entails an indifference towards women, and this increases more and more, turns into aversion, and finally grows into loathing and disgust. Nature here achieves her real purpose with the greater certainty. The more the procreative power decreases in the man, the more decided its unnatural tendency becomes. In keeping with this, we find that pederasty is usually a vice of old men. Only those who have brought matters to a public scandal are caught in the act. To the really manly age, it is something foreign, strange, and even incomprehensible. If there happens to be an exception to this, I think that it can only be the result of an accidental and premature deprivation of the procreative power, which could produce only inferior offspring. And to prevent this, nature diverts this power. Therefore, the young pederasts, who unfortunately are not uncommon in large cities, always direct their hints and proposals to elderly gentlemen, never to those of a vigorous and robust age, or to young men. Even among the Greeks, where custom and example may at times have involved an exception to this rule, we usually find the lover expressly represented by authors as elderly, especially by philosophers, in particular by Plato and Aristotle. In this connection, a passage from Plutarch's Liber Amatorius is specially worth noting. Love of boys begins late, after the bloom of life, an untrue and dark love that drives out the true and original love. Even among the gods we find only the elderly, like Zeus and Hercules, attended by male paramours, not Mars, Apollo, Bacchus, or Mercury. Moreover, in the East, shortage of women resulting from polygamy may at times give rise to forced exceptions to this rule. This can also happen in colonies still new and therefore without women, such as California and others. In keeping with this is also the fact that both immature sperm and that depraved through age can produce only feeble, inferior, and unhappy offspring, and, as in old age, so too in youth, an erotic tendency of such a kind often exists between youths. But it is only extremely rarely that this leads to the actual vice, since it is opposed not only by the motives above mentioned, but also by innocence, chastity, purity, scruples of conscience, and the bashfulness of youth. The result of this discussion is that, whereas the vice we are considering appears to work directly against the aims and ends of nature, and that in a matter that is all-important and of the greatest concern to her, it must in fact serve these very aims, although only indirectly as a means for preventing greater evils. Thus it is a phenomenon of the dying, and again of the immature procreative force, both of which threaten the species with danger, and although they should both cease on moral grounds, yet these could not be relied on, for in her activities nature generally does not take the truly moral into account. Accordingly, in consequence of her own laws, nature was hard-pressed and resorted to a makeshift, a stratagem, by a perversion of the instinct. In fact, it might be said that she built herself an ass's bridge, in order, as explained above, to escape from the greater of two evils. Thus she has in view the important object of preventing miserable and wretched offspring, which might gradually deprave the whole species, And as we have seen, she has no scruples in the choice of means. The spirit in which she goes to work here is the same as that in which she urges wasps to sting their young to death, as mentioned above in chapter 27. For in both cases she resorts to what is bad in order to avoid what is worse. Thus she leads the sexual impulse astray in order to frustrate its most pernicious consequences. In this discussion, my intention has primarily been to solve the striking problem stated at the beginning, and then to confirm my theory discussed at length in the preceding chapter. This theory states that, in all sexual love, instinct holds the reins and creates illusions, since, for nature, the interest of the species takes precedence over all others. This holds good even in the case of the disgusting depravity of the sexual impulse which we are considering, for even here, as the ultimate reason, the aims and ends of the species are the result, although, in this case, they are of a merely negative kind, since nature follows a prophylactic course. Therefore, this discussion throws light on the whole of my metaphysics of sexual love, but a truth hitherto concealed has, through it, been brought to light. In spite of its strangeness, it still sheds new light on the inner essence, the spirit, and the workings of nature. Accordingly, there was here no question of moral admonition against the vice, but of a proper understanding of the essential nature of the matter. For the rest, the true, ultimate, and profoundly metaphysical reason for the objectionable nature of pederasty is that, whereas in it the will to life affirms itself, the effect of that affirmation, which holds open the path to salvation and hence the resumption of life, is completely cut off. Finally, by expounding these paradoxical ideas, I wanted to grant to the professors of philosophy a small favor, for they are very disconcerted by the ever-increasing publicization of my philosophy, which they so carefully concealed. I have done so by giving them the opportunity of slandering me, by saying that I defend and commend pederasty. So let's review what Schopenhauer's had to tell us here. He has begun by saying he will elaborate on pederasty as a kind of misguided instinct, and he notes a kind of contrast. The action in itself, the behavior in itself is abominable, and yet it seems to be present in all cultures. There's, we might say, a kind of conflict between metaphysics and experience. Right? The empirical reality is one way. Pederasty seems inescapable, ubiquitous in every culture, and even the most severe penalties in medieval Europe and modern Europe have not been able to exterminate it completely. And yet, there seems to be no purpose to it. It doesn't seem to fit with what sexuality is, with what sexual instinct is and is for, the service that it's doing to will in terms of perpetuating the human race by getting this woman together with this man to produce this child that's going to be a strong continuation of the species being of the human race, using a phrase that Schopenhauer does not himself use. So having a conflict between the empirical reality and metaphysics, well, we need to resolve this. And this is what Schopenhauer attempts to do. He gives us a long series of examples from antiquity, from the barbarous races of the world, from Asia and China and India. Notes that although it is harshly punished virtually everywhere, and maybe no place so harshly as in Europe, it's not been eradicated. And his conclusion, a fair one perhaps, is that it must have its roots in human nature. Anything that human culture has not been able to succeed in getting rid of has got to have some sort of explanation. And so it falls to Schopenhauer, who's given us what he thinks is a satisfactory theory of human sexuality as instinct, as will, operating at the species level, but using individuals as its instruments. He has to give an updated explanation. So he's given us the setup for his solution then by this point, about a third of the way through the appendix. And he then resolves it in this way. Old men, he says, produce inferior offspring. Right? He takes testimony from ancient sources for this. He asserts, I think without a lot of empirical evidence to back it up, though what could be available to him, that this is in fact the case, that we can observe this in our own lives, that the children of older men, perhaps because of deterioration of their sexual potency or of their cells, their DNA that they pass on, tend to be inferior and weak. To what extent this is the case, it's not clear. That certainly would be relevant, it seems to me, to a judgment like this, but we'll give Schopenhauer
room to make his case. Okay. Need to remember, he says, that nature's sole end, the only goal that nature has in mind, is to produce strong, healthy offspring. Everything else is dispensable in light of that. Right? The goal of will is to keep willing, and the goal of the species will of the human race is to keep the human race alive, keep us going forward with strength that can survive adversity rather than weakness and decadence, which will fail and falter under harsh conditions. Okay? Not quite to the idea of the survival of the fittest and evolution through adaptation and natural selection, but we can sort of feel we're moving in that direction. We're getting into some of that adjacent natural selection adjacent territory, perhaps. Individuals, we must remember, are always only a means for nature. Nature cares nothing for the individual. Nature will crumple up the individual and throw him away without a second thought. And so if we perceive that nature has treated individuals in a certain way by giving them, say, perverse instincts, it's not really we can't really, how shall we say this, hold nature blamable. Right? We can't blame nature for having done this. That nature has under no obligation to us. And again, there's another kind of naturalistic attitude that I think is coming through here in Schopenhauer's writings and in his reasonings about human beings and human behavior and human sexuality. Nature, he says, will not rely on political wisdom, like having a good ruler who will regulate the sexuality and the reproductive habits of his people. And it's certainly not going to rely on individual judgment informed by reason. Both those things, political wisdom and individual reason, would just trust that old men will realize that they shouldn't reproduce, just despite the fact that they still want to, because it would be bad for the human race. No, those are not going to be in any way satisfactory solutions to this problem. Nature's got us covered, though. Nature's not going to work through anything as clumsy or stupid or failure prone as human choices and human deliberation at the individual or the collective level. Okay? In order to force old men to stop procreating, nature's going to use instinct, her favorite tool, right? She's right up inside of our headspace. She can make us do things. This is nature sort of personified. Read will here for nature, I think, just as well. We should note here, nature is thoroughly amoral, right? We shouldn't use moral categories to describe nature's actions, and we shouldn't experience the kind of emotions of indignation that we feel when we feel we've been done wrong. We don't approve or disdain the wasp stinging its young to death. We simply look at it and say, well, this is how nature accomplishes her goal. Okay? He does say here, and this may be hard to hear, Schopenhauer's call on this is that pederasty as a practice may be harmful to young men, but the harm to young men from nature's perspective is the lesser of two evils. It prevents the greater harm that would come from having a whole bunch of deficient older men producing young who would then be sickly, who would bring down the stock of the human race, etc. But keep in mind here, nature doesn't operate morally. Nature is thoroughly amoral. So if she hurts one group of people in order to achieve her goal, which is the betterment of the human race through another group of people, that's what nature does. He does observe that the tendency to pederasty seems to appear at about the age of 50, mid-50s, that it is relatively rare in Europe today. That observation about Aristotle in the mid-50s will be important for something that Brian McGee will say later in this video, so keep that in mind when we come to that later part. Nature ultimately achieves her goal in this case. Nature wins because men in whom she places this tendency towards an instinct for attraction to young men develop an aversion or a disgust towards women. And this is what prevents them from sort of indirectly, right? Their attachment to men and boys makes them disgusted with women, and therefore they're not going to go off and start making babies with them. And nature wins. Nature says, that's all I wanted. That's what I wanted in the first place. Whether it involves, and blessing or suffering, happiness or misery for individuals, well, nature doesn't care. She never has cared. Okay, might even say she doesn't even perceive the happiness or misery of the individuals with whom she's messing. Okay. Schopenhauer says in the process, right, that attraction to pederasty will result from depraved sexual power, or he says at one place an immature sexual power. I think there he's speaking both about sort of the young pederasts and the elderly pederasts, and they sort of are kind of attracted
to each other, that they seek each other out for just this reason. Neither one of them would be able to create strong, healthy offspring. There's something of Schopenhauer's reasoning here that I've heard applied to some neo-Darwinian reasoning as well, of the sociobiological variety and others, that there's something of the Rudyard Kipling just so story about it. There's the kind of feeling that, well, this is probably the story that explains the way things are, because things are a certain way, paradoxical way, and we need an explanation. So some of this, I don't know if you guys agree with me, tell me in the comments. Some of this feels a little bit forced, like, have to account for this, and so here's the sort of what must be happening behind the scenes in order to account for it. It has the effect of saving the system, perhaps, maybe even producing some genuine philosophical and anthropological insight. But as a theory, as a story, it feels to me like it's not proceeding from data, it's proceeding sort of from empirical observation to the need to reconcile it with the metaphysical system to which Schopenhauer is firmly committed, the metaphysics of will. It's just my own observation. What else did I write in my notes here? The result here, says Schopenhauer at the end, is that the danger to the race, to the human race, from old and depraved men and from young, immature men, both of whom have kind of either declining or perverted, somehow damaged sexual power, is neutralized. Right? Nature uses instinct, uses the perversion of an instinct, right? She's sort of going to take these two people, neither of whom should produce children. I'll just sort of pair them off together and set them off in a corner. No children will be coming out of that line of the human race. Seems to be Schopenhauer's reasoning. Okay? This is nature using the bad to prevent the worse. Something that nature does all the time, including in the case of the wasps that sting their offspring. He wraps this up then, I think, with a nice bit of style here at the very end of the passage. This fits with Schopenhauer's theory. He says that all sexual love is instinct-driven, right? Our individual choice in the matter, our feelings of attraction, of love, of passion, all of that is instinct is the real driver. Our subjective experience of it may be that she's the only one for me, or I choose her and I reject all others. That's nature is pulling my strings, or I'm nature's puppet in this case. Okay. He emphasizes that his goal here is proper understanding, not moral admonition. I'm not here to condemn this practice, although he does use words like abomination and the others. He says in the end, what makes it bad is that it's sterile. In this kind of sexual activity, the will to life affirms itself, but it affirms itself in a way that it's cut off from even the remotest possibility of producing any kind of offspring, which is the ultimate goal, metaphysical goal of the sexual power. Is one of the places where Schopenhauer comes off sounding rather like a late 20th century Catholic, if you don't mind my saying so. This is Schopenhauer spinning in his grave, perhaps hear me say that, but you guys can call me on that if you think that's an unfair comparison. But sex is about children at the metaphysical level, and the problem with this is no children. So, and then there's, of course, the great ending where he says, I'm also going to, I've written this chapter also in part to give my opponents the chance to point to it and lie about me, to slander me, and say that I defend and support pederasty. So, also a bit of Schopenhauerian self-promotion here, even in the final years of his life. The philosophy professors are afraid of me because my work is getting out into the public. It's being read more. I'm becoming more and more famous now, despite their many, many attempts over all the decades to suppress my work and keep me from getting the recognition I deserve. They're scared. And so they're going to lie about me and say that I defend pederasty. So my hope here is that I've not given my own critics an opportunity to say that I have defended pederasty by making this video. As a bonus in this video, I'd like to share with you some passages from two recent scholars about Schopenhauer, specifically about this appendix on pederasty. The first of these is Brian McGee, British philosopher and author of The Philosophy of Schopenhauer, first published in 1983, revised and expanded in 2009. I was told that this book is out of print, which is why I own an ex-library copy now. A student has since told me that he believes it may be available on archive.org. So if I have that link, I'll put it in the description to this episode. McGee has a chapter 16 in this book, beginning on page 346, titled Schopenhauer's Addendum on Homosexuality. It's about 3.5 pages long, and I won't read the whole thing, but I'll read a part of it here. Let me read for you what McGee tells us, skipping over and summarizing some parts. Chapter 44 of Volume 2 of The World as Will and Representation is called The Metaphysics of Sexual Love. For the third edition of the book, published in 1859, when Schopenhauer was 71, he tacked on to it an addendum, which he called simply Appendix to the preceding chapter, and which is about male homosexuality, a subject to which there had been only the most glancing reference in the second edition and none at all in the first. The sudden appearance of this appendix is surprising in more ways than one. First, no other such self-contained edition was made on any other subject in either volume of the work. Second, in it the author discusses coolly and attempts to understand and explain a phenomenon which in his day was felt to be shocking in the extreme, and was either not mentioned at all or was discussed with much show of horror and moral outrage. It was a topic, moreover, which no other philosopher had dealt with since the Greeks, and which readers would not expect to be discussed in a philosophical work. Schopenhauer succeeds ingenuously enough in offering an explanation of homosexuality which fits into the general framework of his theoretical system. But reading between the lines, I get an irresistible impression that the subject is brought in because of personal experiences which fell to him comparatively late in life, and which took him by surprise. That's the first paragraph, reading here from Brian McGee's book. He goes on to summarize the chapter, the appendix that we've just talked about. I'm going to skip ahead to the following page, page 347, if you're looking it up here for yourself. McGee writes, "What Schopenhauer's treatment of homosexuality suggests to me is that he himself had felt homosexual inclinations, not only in adolescence, but also in late middle age or old age. We know that as a young man he had an overmastering sexual drive, so much so that, like Sophocles, he felt himself to be a slave in thrall to a mad and savage master. It would be entirely unremarkable for such a person to have passed through a homosexually oriented phase in adolescence. In fact, most of us do as a normal stage of our development. However, it also looks as if such impulses stirred in him again later in life. And furthermore, that he was horrified by them and did not give way to them, but was moved by the experience to think about homosexuality afresh. And this led him to see it in a new light, not as a crazy perversion which only a monster could practice, but as a natural impulse which anyone, even an Arthur Schopenhauer, could feel a temptation to indulge. If one reads his treatment of the subject with close attention, the following personal history suggests itself. Quote, at about the age stated by Aristotle, as being that which men should stop having children, that is to say the age of 54, Schopenhauer became aware in himself of homosexual feelings towards young men. These feelings grew as the years went by, and the process was accompanied by a diminution of sexual interest in women, towards whom he developed an aversion, which became, in the end, loathing and disgust. During this period, he was, unfortunately, importuned by young homosexuals in Frankfurt. Okay, keeping in mind here, this is McGee speculating. It is unclear whether or not this was by way of prostitution, but Schopenhauer does mention that the soliciting of elderly gentlemen by young pederasts is not uncommon in large cities, and this suggests male prostitution of a character which is commonplace enough in our own day. Though tempted, he resisted the temptation and never committed a homosexual act. Parentheses. I think this is both the confession and the claim implied by the epigraph to the whole appendix, an exchange from Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, which reads, "Do you make bold so shamelessly to utter such a word and think to escape punishment?" Answer, I have escaped, for truth bears me witness. So, close the parentheses there. However, he had been singed by the experience and emerged from it shaken. He had always regarded sodomy as a monstrosity to which only the most utterly depraved natures could descend, but now he found himself re-examining the question in light of personal experience. The result was a sort of gestalt switch in his perceptions. He saw what in a sense had always been staring him in the face, namely that homosexual interest and activity are omnipresent. And here, for the remainder of this paragraph, McGee quotes from the appendix that we've just read. Concluding this chapter on page 349, this last bit I'll read from McGee.
Not only does Schopenhauer's appendix on homosexuality indicate on internal evidence a personal history of the kind I have just conjectured, but such an interpretation would also fit the chronology of his writings in general. The absence of any discussion of homosexuality in the first edition of The World as Will and Representation, the insertion of a reference to it in the second edition, which came out when he was 56, the famous critique of women in Pererga and Paralipomena, which appeared when he was 63, and then finally the explicit confrontation of the subject when at the age of 71. He knew that to write with such directness on this shocking subject might do him harm, but he was undeterred. He ended the appendix with the words, finally, and we've just read that, quoted that, I shall give my opponents the opportunity to slander me by saying that I defend pederasty. McGee now. But the most impressive aspect of it all was that characteristic in Schopenhauer which most influenced Nietzsche, who tried consciously to copy it, namely his utterly fearless honesty, not only with society, but with himself, his ability not just to speak out the unmentionable, but to confront within himself the unthinkable. So that is a significant portion, maybe about half, of Brian McGee's short chapter on the appendix from The Philosophy of Schopenhauer. I think it's that I'll share two thoughts about that. I'm anxious to hear what you guys think in the comments. Let me know about the plausibility of this. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with speculating about authors' histories, conjecturing on what's called internal evidence from the chronology of their lives and what they write. So the plausibility of what he writes, or I'd say its fairness to Schopenhauer, I don't know. I'm uncertain about that. I think the bit at the end is quite beautifully written, right? That if this is the case, well, regardless whether the personal history is there or not, Schopenhauer does have this kind of devil-may-care fearlessness about confronting a social phenomenon and directing it. And he said repeatedly in what we've just read, I'm going to bracket the morality of this entirely. He'll use moral terms. He'll talk about abomination and the like. But when it comes to talking about nature and instinct, we're just talking about what is, not about anything that may or may not be advisable or welcome morally. So that's Brian McGee. The second thing I wanted to share with you, just a few short passages and part of a footnote from the most recent biography of Schopenhauer. That's this book by David Bather Woods, Arthur Schopenhauer, The Life and Thought of Philosophy's Greatest Pessimist, from Chicago, University of Chicago Press. This came out in 2025, and I read it a couple of months ago. I think it's quite a good biography. If you want a first-time biography of Schopenhauer, I think you could do well with this one. It's not a strict chronology of his life. It's arranged in terms of chapters, each of which has a certain kind of grounded integrity of its own, dealing with certain topics that were relevant to different periods of Schopenhauer's life. So there's a topic about his attitude towards fame, towards madness, a lot of interesting details there about Schopenhauer's experience with residents of an insane asylum, for example, if I recall correctly, why Schopenhauer left academia, why he never married. So with allowances for that formatting, I think it was quite a good and quite an informative biography of Schopenhauer. I feel I know him a good deal better after having read Bather Wood's biography. But I want to go to the particular part of chapter 6 of this book, titled Love Stories Without Love, where relatively briefly, Bather Woods just gives us a few paragraphs summarizing and commenting on the appendix that this video is about. He leads into this on page 133, saying, however, Schopenhauer later revised his views on same-sex relationships in two important ways. First, for the third and final edition of The World as Will and Representation, published in 1859, he added an appendix to his chapter on sexual love that retracted his remark that the sense of beauty can degenerate into a pederastic tendency. His retraction did not start off well. Then he quotes the passage about pederasty viewed in itself as an unnatural monstrosity. Okay. The remainder of this paragraph, he goes on to summarize a good chunk of what we've just read. Mentions that essentially Schopenhauer determined that anything that's so universal and ubiquitous cannot be unnatural in every sense of the word. He therefore challenged himself to explain why such unnatural sexualities are in some sense natural after all. He, in his explanation, he never dropped his assumption that nature's ultimate aim is to produce offspring. Indeed, he attempted to figure out how certain kinds of same-sex relationships could serve that aim. Well, we just heard that. He also struck with the classically Greek model, namely sex between young boys and men, hence why he persisted with the now archaic term pederasty. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. With these assumptions in mind, writes Bather Woods, he finally settled on the view that pederasty is nature's way of simultaneously satisfying the sex drives of boys, who are too young to reproduce, and men, who are too old, by getting them to have sex with each other instead. That's a little bit glib and neat. I'll comment there, but it's a biography for popular consumption, perhaps. By today's standards, this is unsatisfactory for any number of reasons, not least because it reinforces a pernicious conflation between gay relationships on the one hand and sex between adults and minors on the other. Nevertheless, Schopenhauer was at least undogmatic enough to put the assumptions of his day to the test of experience and find them lacking. He knew furthermore that he took a risk by publishing anything even faintly encouraging on this topic. Then he quotes the final line of the appendix. I've given my opponents the opportunity to slander me. There is a footnote to this section, and I want to go to this and also go back to Bather Wood's criticism of the use of the term, the archaic term pederasty. It's footnote 44. I'll jump ahead to page 257, again, just for people who want to get hold of the book themselves. In a footnote to what I've just read, Bather Woods writes, for example, Brian McGee, in The Philosophy of Schopenhauer, says that Schopenhauer's addendum is about male homosexuality in general, rather than pederasty in particular. McGee also speculates on Schopenhauer's own sexuality, suggesting that the addendum contains internal evidence. Although Schopenhauer had one or two intimate male relationships, for example, Antimi, who's discussed in this book earlier, a friend from his youth, there is no evidence of a sexual relationship with another man in Schopenhauer's biography. Equally, of course, at the time, such evidence would not have been the kind of thing to record, and the primary biographical sources for Schopenhauer are admittedly fragmentary. For example, his family were prone to destroy his letters, and his executor, Wilhelm von Gewinner, claimed to have destroyed many autobiographical writings after using them as materials for the first biography of Schopenhauer. So I wanted to include that, especially because Bather Woods reacts to what I just shared from you from Brian McGee, noting that McGee jumps immediately to the assumption that Schopenhauer is writing not about pederasty specifically, about sexual relationships between adult men or elderly men and adolescent boys, but rather male homosexuality in general. Yeah. And I do think that seems like that is a leap on McGee's part, and perhaps an unjustified one. What puzzles me, though, and I don't mean this as a sharp criticism, just as an observation, is that I'd just gotten done reading a moment before about criticism, seems like a criticism in context, of Schopenhauer for sticking to the classical Greek model, which is and using the term pederasty to describe it. It seems to me that the author here may not be entirely certain whether he thinks that Schopenhauer is referring to all male homosexual relationships or only the ones that fall under this heading of pederasty, whatever non-archaic term might be used to describe it. So I'd recommend both books to you if you want to know more about Schopenhauer. They ought to both be easily acquirable. This one's still, I think, in hardback. The McGee book, perhaps online or in paperback editions, since it's been around for several decades. So that I welcome your comments on either of these two contemporary authors I've included here at the end of this video. This brings the close to this video about Schopenhauer's Appendix on Pederasty, to the chapter 44 from Volume 2 of World as Will and Representation on the metaphysics of sexual love. It also brings an end to this entire video series about the metaphysics of sexual love. It's taken a good bit of time and quite a few videos to get through all of it, and I appreciate and thank all of you who've come with me all the way to the end of this. I'm hoping to turn to some other work of Schopenhauer, perhaps his essays on human nature, or another one of the volumes of essays edited by Bailey Saunders. I'll begin on that in a new series, which I hope to present to you soon. Thank you for watching today. Goodbye.